Majorca is almost paradise. Bright golden sun, floral breeze, and cloudless skies. I had a steamy bottle of San Miguel in front of me as I basked in the shade of a potted palm tree, reminiscing about the last 3 miserable years. I can't even tell you what was more painful, the loss of my marriage or the tragic plane crash that followed. Anyway, both events were tied together by one man, Colonel David Osborne, or as I affectionately called him, the asshole. The asshole moved up the career ladder by licking the right butts. Therefore, he believed all that was required were the 2 Bs, combativeness and bravado. He had them in abundance, as well as the other 2 Bs, bluff and nonsense. This ultimately caused its collapse. My life and happiness were just collateral damage. When my story began, I was the captain of the 780th Military Intelligence Brigade. This might sound nice until you know that the main qualification for my 2 golden sleepers was a master's degree in software engineering from Carnegie Mellon. The 780th is an offensive unit, no different in concept from the Armored Corps at Fort Knox. But the people standing on the bastions in our digital age are not classic Marines with sculpted jaws. These are the guys the Marines put in lockers. And yet, ironically, they are the ones who now protect us from the unthinkable. Every country faces traditional military threats. They are all more or less serious. But armed conflicts, invasions, and very close nuclear war have existed for several decades. Cyber war is a horse of a different color. Cyber attacks can come from anywhere. They happen instantly, and their results are no less catastrophic than if someone dropped a nuclear bomb on you. Don't believe me? Well, believe me, because if, for example, a cyber attack knocks out our electrical grid, and this is not at all impossible, we will all have the opportunity to live in the 18th century, permanently. What's worse is that it doesn't require expensive military equipment. All you need is the right know-how, and that, unfortunately, can be found in every shitty country on the planet. Therefore, the only effective way to convince a potential criminal that mass extinction would be a very bad idea is to remind him that he would be better off digging 2 graves at once. That was my job. My specialty is worms. No, not those. Earthworms are good for your lawn. I was a master at creating self-replicating malware called internet worms, and my little pets could bring a post-industrial society to its knees in a matter of minutes. That's why at Fort Meade I was considered something of a grise. I look fine, taller than most with a long face, deep-set gray eyes, and an unruly mop of dark hair. But underneath that, I'm a devout geek, and people like me don't spend much time in the real world. My interests are focused mainly in cyberspace, mainly in games. It was there that I met and even teamed up with Tiffin Ellerian in the Warcraft MMO. She was in the same Alliance faction as me and was a strong human mage for my blonde paladin. I've always wondered what Tiffin looked like. Of course, there was no way I could encounter her in physical space, and I probably wouldn't have liked it. Because in the real world, my ideal woman could be anyone, from a bisexual who likes hard sex, whose legs have never been shaved, to an overweight nerd who lives in her parents' basement and gets a thrill from imagining herself as a woman. Then I worked at FanX, a complex of National Security Agency facilities. This is not a shining citadel on a hill called Fort Meade. FanX is located in Linthicum, Maryland, next to BWI, Baltimore-Washington Airport, and is relatively free of plate swords, i.e., senior ranks. Therefore, there is a completely different atmosphere here. There's all sorts of stuff here, like the crypto school and a ghost ops unit like mine. But like any other establishment, they throw a Christmas party for the rabble. And since FanX has all the charm of an airport baggage area, this party usually takes place at the Marriott Hotel in Baltimore's Inner Harbor. Like I said, I'm a nerd with all the social graces of a high-end living room sofa, but the colonel with the bird, to whom I was subordinate, made it clear that my presence was mandatory. So there I was, in my dress uniform, lurking at the back of the party, trying to look interested, wishing I was in the Shadowlands or anywhere but here. It was then that I noticed a gorgeous woman sitting alone at a large round table at the end of the room. She radiated irritation and boredom. which undoubtedly explained the lack of suitors, because she was simply stunning. My botanical gift began to squeak, and I thought to myself, she may be hot, but she's one of us. A nerd can always be recognized. It's something about the way we sit on the sidelines and look down on everyone around us. So, being socially retarded myself, I decided to come over and say hello. She radiated the demand. "Don't talk to me!" Naturally, I spoke. "You seem to be as bored as I am." She studied me with a half smile, as if appraising a particularly interesting species of rodent, and said, "You're wasting your time." I pulled up a chair and said, "Can I sit down?" She made an inviting gesture. "This is a free country. Just don't expect me to talk." I sat down and said, addressing no one in particular, "Okay, then I will speak. You're here because your boss made you come. You would like to be anywhere but here because all these happy people are driving you crazy. So instead of drinking and socializing, you want to do what you usually do on a Friday night, surf the internet." I stopped and said sardonically, "How am I doing so far?" She smiled involuntarily, and I added, "I know I'm right, because that's the only reason I'm here and not in the Shadowlands, which is the place of choice for any time I'm not at work." She perked up noticeably and said, "Really? Seriously? Are you a gamer?" I extended my hand and said, "Lothar Kingslaughter, light-skinned Draenei paladin." She gasped and reflexively put her hand to her delicious breasts. Then she said excitedly, "Tiffin Ellarian, human mage." I exclaimed in shock, "My God, are you her?" She nodded readily. It was as if we were former high school sweethearts suddenly bumping into each other at our 20th high school reunion. That's the story of how a potentially painful evening turned into one of the best evenings of my life. We spent hours talking about really important things, like the strategies we used to defeat the Burning Legion's minions and our experiences in Azeroth. This may seem strange and abstruse to you, because none of what we talked about actually happened, except perhaps in our imagination. But for Tiffin and me, these events were as real as the mating dances that take place among muggles. It's just that this time, while talking, we didn't look at the monitor and didn't put on headphones as usual. Finally, I said, "Eric." She looked puzzled. I added, "My real name. Gamers have to make such explanations." She gave me a sweet smile with two charming dimples and said, "Rebecca, my name is Rebecca." This began a 14-month period of complete bliss as we got to know each other, fell in love, and got married. My wife, Rebecca, or Becky, as I affectionately called her, was nature's way of saying, "Take a bite." Anyone who believes that a beautiful and sexy woman cannot be a genius. Mathematical gifts come early, and Becky was one of those child geniuses. I have no idea what my wife's IQ was, but she graduated from Caltech with a PhD in mathematics at the tender age of 21 and worked for Central Security. That's where the real smart people are. The NSA assigned her to the cryptanalytics department, where she studied methods for breaking elliptic curve encryption. One day she tried to explain what it was. But I'm just a humble programmer, and this experience was so harrowing that I had to use our safe word to tap out, "Pineapple! Pineapple!" Suffice it to say, my wife operated on a different plane than I did. She lived in an ivory tower of theory and mathematical abstractions, even though her efforts indirectly influenced some of the worst people in the world. And in this sense, she was a real magician. Her destiny was spells and enchantments. And me? Like most paladins, my abilities are more likely to relate to brute strength. That's what programmers are like. We're not crafty, sort of the Oompa Loompas of science. However, one of my modern persistent threats or distributed denial of service can ruin your whole day. Like I said, brutal. If you saw my wife at a party, you wouldn't notice how weird she is. Instead, you would see an absolutely stunning woman with high cheekbones, a long, straight nose, and a wide, almost lustful mouth. She loved to laugh. Her Irish ancestors demanded it, and she loved jokes. Looking down at her beautiful face, I saw a scattering of freckles on her incredibly plump cheeks and her glowing blue eyes. Her almost transparent alabaster skin and silky shoulder-length hair black as a raven's wing, and bright red lipstick and nails created a riot of colors. Becky loved to ride her bike, and her daily 90-minute workouts on the roads gave her a slender body with incredibly muscular thighs and legs that carried her forward with a smooth, graceful gait. Despite this, my wife was a nerd through and through. Becky valued rationality and self-discipline far above sexual attractiveness. Therefore, her actions and clothes were not provocative, and she went out of her way to minimize her rich assets. This was not just about her public image, but also about how she perceived herself as a person and how she wanted others to perceive her. In many ways, Becca's denial of her own femininity was her fatal flaw. Because by nature my wife was a deeply passionate woman, and as a result, her personality and values were constantly at war with her fundamental nature. This battle was fought deep within her psyche, like Vesuvius waiting to erupt. I have always believed that intelligence and sexual activity are interconnected. Becky was living proof of this. She loved sex the way a gourmet loves cordon bleu. She was always there for me in the moment, as if I were the only man in her universe, and her creativity and responsiveness would make you think you were John Holmes standing on the shoulders of King Kong. Despite this, Becca felt embarrassed about her diametrically opposed feelings. I partly understood her attitude. This was not a moral issue. It was a denial of her beliefs. People with Becca's intelligence level distrust instincts and despise emotions. They value rational observation and analysis. The problem is that my wife's sexual appetite did not always allow her to do this. So she was essentially afraid of her own instincts. Becky wanted people to appreciate her for her mind, not her body, and her selfless behavior during sex was an unwanted contradiction. In the end, I asked as diplomatically as I could why she, being such a holy terror in bed, never dressed or even showed the slightest hint of her eye-catching sexuality. She looked embarrassed and said, "Sex is the most illogical act I can think of. So even though I love the thrill, I just can't get over how crazy I am going. This unsettles me." Then she looked at me hesitantly, as if I might not believe what she was about to tell me, and said, "I trust you and want to give myself completely to you. So my solution is to tell myself that Tiffin is making all this noise. I'm just not participating here. Wow! It really makes sense. Each person's reality is nothing more than what your brain interprets through the five senses. It captures this data and turns it into a personal view of the world. So, in essence, your very existence is nothing more than what this soft organ in our head says. And because everyone is wired differently, we can exist in 8 billion separate universes. Becca's inner world was understandably deep and complex. And given the very imaginative virtual space we both preferred, her rationalization of her sexuality was completely valid and acceptable to me, no matter how crazy it might sound to someone else. Gamers often choose avatars that represent a different side of themselves. Well, that is, Lothar Kingslaughter is a violent sword-wielding man, not a tall, skinny nerd. But this is how I imagine myself in virtual space, and this is how I see myself in my imagination, even if no one else sees me that way. In fact, the woman I slept with was not my shy, coldly logical wife, but Tiffin Ellerian, the hypersexual sorceress. And in Becca's mind, it was Tiffin who acted like a wild woman, not her. You may laugh, but remember that when you shout, "Drop the damn flag," you are just pixels on the screen. Or, on a personal level, virtual reality is as real to a gamer as some bad decision is to you. You're just not a player, my friend. Essentially, my wife consciously decided to be innocent, at least when it came to her relationships with men. And since both of her personalities were interchangeable in her own inventive little mind, transferring her sexual behavior to her avatar allowed her to maintain her real-world image of herself as the rational, balanced, and analytical person she had chosen to be. Of course, this schizoid compromise also made her unable to recognize when she was being sexually manipulated in the real world. It also didn't give her any practical means of defense, since she was one. As a result, Becky in her everyday persona was naive and vulnerable, like the girl next door, especially when it came to the cunning of predatory boys. But more on that later. We had everything: a good house, a wonderful neighborhood, and more importantly, a warm and cozy marital relationship. We lived in the city of Columbia, 20 minutes from Feet. They did everything together, and Becky was the best friend and companion a man could ask for. She was always carefree and happy and a pleasure to be around. She was obsessively polite, had an almost irrational fear of conflict, and never thought that others had ulterior motives. Therefore, she did not push anyone away even if they put pressure on her. I just went with the flow. On the surface, Becky was attentive and loving in a guileless, almost self-effacing way, so much so that you had no idea that such a formidable IQ was driving her interactions. In fact, most of the time, she was eager to please and was friendly like our golden retriever, warm, caring, and open to everyone. I loved her with all my heart, and our life was full of joy. We had a 12-meter yacht, Island Packet, which we sailed from Kirwans on the Chesapeake. The yacht was clearly a pamper, but we both loved sailing. It was an intellectual challenge. If you want brainless fun, buy yourself a jet ski. Getting anywhere on the wind alone requires ingenuity and seamanship. My old man put me on a sunfish boat and sent me out to Lake Huron at the tender age of 7. So I was practically born a sailor. I knew how to handle big water, and as an adult, competed in the Port Huron to Mackinac Regatta in everything from a tartan cruiser to a Great Lakes 52. They say that if you really want to experience the joy of sailing, you need to stand fully clothed in a cold shower while tearing up $100 bills. But it didn't matter to Becca or me. The hours we spent on our boat were our special time together. On weekends, we sailed the bay, sometimes as far as Cape Charles, and anchored each night in small coves, far from any shipping lanes. We enjoyed the peace and quiet of an East Coast summer evening, drinking good Cabernet and just taking in the sights, sounds, and smells of nature. Then we retired to our small cabin, where Tiffin Ilarion emerged from the Twilight Lands. Becky may be a nerd, but Tiffin has a voracious appetite, and I've always been a tasty snack. My wife was charged with sexual energy in the silvery moonlight, penetrating through the prisms of the deck. Her bright blue eyes were almost cobalt, and she was practically shaking with anticipation. I looked at her naked, slender, elastic body with steep, smooth hips, long legs, and perfectly proportioned breasts, and marveled at my luck. She said in a choked voice, "No caresses, just take me, now." It was Tiffin who spoke. Becky had never used the word take in her life. She pulled her long, beautifully sculpted legs towards her knees, and I carefully crawled between them. What followed was scratching, hitting, thrusting, a hot period of time that felt more like cage fighting than sex. Tiffin Ilarion was a warrior, and her weapon was the perfect body of my wife. She wriggled like a snake. Our sweat lubricated her. She screamed and screamed with delight. It ended with a frantic scream. She went limp just as the world ended for me, and I came like the Midnight Express, while my wife made contented gurgling sounds of unconscious pleasure. After that, I rolled onto my side and caught my breath for several long minutes. When I opened my eyes, Becky returned. She looked at me with the intense, piercing gaze she gets when she's contemplating a particularly difficult math problem. I asked worriedly, "What's the matter, baby?" She answered with tears in her eyes. "I just love you very much. I don't want to lose you," I said, still worried. "You just ate my brains out." "After such a performance, what makes you think that you will lose me?" Of course, I forgot that I am now talking to another inhabitant of my dear wife's skull. She said with all sincerity, "I just don't feel like I'm good enough for you." This statement was absurd, but self-doubt was part of the basic nature of my humble, self-sufficient, and completely crazy wife. Maybe this applies to all women? How should I know? Botanists are not known for their insight. As the old Yiddish saying goes, man proposes, but God disposes. It was my appearance on the list for promotion that brought the snake into the garden. I liked the army. She gave me a stable and predictable life. I did what I liked and was appreciated for it. I would make a lot more money in big software. But I was attracted to the service aspect, And frankly, people with my almost complete lack of social skills need to be in a highly structured environment. My work consisted of two parts. The first was to maintain our aggressive code registry. It was tabloid stuff like Stuxnet and a million other pieces of malware you've never heard of that I'd have to kill you for if you found out. The other part was detecting anomalies that help us find and destroy other people's little nasties in cyberspace. As a side project, more of a hobby, really, I've been working on a fork of my anomaly detection code. It was a heuristic AI engine that could be integrated into other applications to create human-like cognition. Or, to put it simply, I was trying to reflect people's thinking and learning in a way that created a man in a box. The number of applications of this in the real world would be endless. I'd been doing my little hobby off and on for over a dozen years, which is to say, I started 2 years before I met and married Becky. Creating the program architecture took an incredibly long time because I had to conceptualize every variable that underlies empirical thinking. In order to pay my way to nerd school at Carnegie Mellon, at age 18, I signed a contract with the Army. So, approaching my golden 20s, I was close to finishing the prototype. Further implementation would be easy. I was already starting to think that it was time for me to retire and make my little invention public. However, the difference of $20,000 a year between the half salary of a captain, which would be my pension, and that of a major, was a strong incentive for me to rise in rank first. I didn't seek or want a promotion, but when the seniority criteria for the specialty were met, I received a notification and simply got into the program. Actual promotions were in the hands of the promotion board, consisting of officers ranging from major to colonel. Everything was according to the rules. This required the usual supporting documents from the Center for Outcomes and effectiveness research, which I then handed over to a senior officer, in this case, David Osborne. Osborne was colonel of the brigade. After reading, he had to pass them along with his comments. But I never met him face to face. Everything changed at the next Christmas party. Strangely, the beginning and end of my happiness coincided with 2 Christmases a dozen years apart. Becky was a civilian at the fort and had her own party the previous weekend. For this occasion, she bought a dress that was daring for her, but she was celebrating with her fellow nerds, and the idea that she might be giving off sexual vibes didn't cross her mind. Being my practical wife, she simply reused the dress for my party. It showed off her gorgeous legs and, for the sake of variety, was shoulderless. So there was a little more cleavage. It was red, a perfect contrast to her black hair, blue eyes, and alabaster skin. To say the least, Becky was stunning, which she probably didn't expect and would be embarrassed if she found out. We walked into the Marriott ballroom and conversations literally stopped. Osborne kept a low profile with his usual collection of sycophants. Lieutenant Colonel Wysocki, Major Sharp, and a whole squad of bright-eyed, bushy-tailed junior officers. My height is 1.90 meters, but Osborne was even taller, 1.95 meters. I have the build of a runner, weighing 86 kilograms. Osborne was closer to 113, with big shoulders and an even bigger belly. He came from the infantry and just radiated machismo. The colonel was an impressive guy. He also mastered the steely-eyed commander's gaze to perfection, so that when he turned to look at us, he looked like an American eagle. It was an effective look, and I heard Becky take a shaky breath. This was something new. I've never heard my wife react like that to anyone before. The colonel said something to his crowd of adoring fans. Then he strode towards us, radiating military arrogance, without taking his eyes off my wife. When he approached us, we exchanged greetings and a handshake, and he said with feigned cheerfulness, "It's good that you were able to come. I had never met this man in my life, but he had a photo of me in his results and effectiveness research folder, and it was clear that Becky was the one who caught his attention." I said, "I am very pleased to be here, sir," which was a lie, but what else could I say? He said, continuing to carry on a light conversation, but looking thoughtfully at Becky, "Why don't we find some place where we can talk about your promotion?" Then he turned to Becky and said, I am sure that such a beautiful lady as you will be able to find many people to talk to while I hold your husband captive. Remarking on my wife's attractiveness was almost crossing a line, but Osborne was a brash man if he was anything. Becca's alabaster skin turned a beautiful shade of scarlet, and she said worriedly, "I'll wait here." But Osborne wanted no such thing. He called Sharp over and said sternly, "Find this magnificent creature a drink while I roast her husband." This year he is on the list. Sharp was a skinny little weasel with a bushy mustache that looked like a hedgehog, had crawled onto his lip, and died. He was clearly happy to spend at least a little time with Becky and said, "Come on, I'll introduce you to everyone." "Can I offer you a drink?" Becky said hesitantly, still looking dazed. "I'll have Chardonnay, thank you." Osborne turned to Sharp and said imperiously, "Bring the lady a drink." Then he grabbed me by the shoulder in a completely inappropriate friendly hug and led me into a side room that seemed to be intended for meetings. He started the conversation by asking me the usual questions about my background and career ambitions. He was a regular Army infantryman, and I was something completely different. So explaining what I do and where it leads was like describing cyber warfare to a pet dog. But that was not the point. He still didn't pay attention to my answers. It was clear that he was interested in my wife. Because he started asking me a bunch of personal questions. How I met Becky, and what the current state of our marriage was. It seemed to me that his questions crossed all boundaries. Still, what options did I have? I could report him, but he was too high in the command chain, and they would protect him there. Besides, my future was in his hands. So I gave him vague answers, kicking myself for not turning on the recorder. He kept me in this small room for over an hour. He seemed to be stalling for time. When he finished, he said with what I read as feigned sincerity, "Well, the discussion was productive, Captain. I'm confident I can take your promotion further." We saluted each other, he turned and walked toward his group, and I headed toward the bar. After what I had just experienced, I needed to drink something strong and maybe take a shower. At that moment, Sharp reappeared, his whiskers bristling like the fur on the back of an eager Jack Russell. He said, "I spoke with the colonel, and he wants me to brief you on what to expect in the remainder of the process." I looked at my watch and said, "It can't wait? I left my wife alone for too long." He looked at me with a blank look and said, "It will only take a few minutes, and everyone else will take care of her." If only I knew what that really meant. His few minutes turned out to be closer to 45, and in total more than 2 hours passed before I started looking for Becky. The ballroom was huge and filled with enthusiastic people celebrating. I walked around the periphery of the room, trying to find my wife. I had almost walked around the entire hall when I saw a flash of red. Becky stood with the colonel's group and looked drunk. This was surprising for several reasons. First of all, I have never seen her drink more than 2 glasses of wine. Secondly, and more importantly, there was no way she could act like that in public. Osborne stood possessively next to her, and Becky seemed to lean against his shoulder. It didn't look intimate, as she was just trying to stay on her feet. The others fussed around them both as the great man dispensed his wisdom. His subordinates nodded approvingly. I walked through the group and walked straight up to her. Becky gave me a sentimental grin and babbled, delighted to see me. "Finally?" She was holding a full glass of wine and was clearly in the trash. I didn't understand how she got to this state, but he knew that in the morning she would be very ashamed. The last thing I wanted was to humiliate her even more by abruptly dragging her away like she was drunk. So instead, I smiled at the group and said, "Sorry, guys, but we have to get up early tomorrow, so it's time for us to leave." Becky spoke in a tearful voice. "Don't be such a bore, Kitty. Now I realized that she was drunk because throughout our marriage she never called me Cat. Maybe it was Tiffin who spoke," I said to myself, giving vent to my irritation about this whole shit show. "You're not a bore, but I am, and it's already late," Osborne said in a voice impatient of disagreement. "Come on, we're just starting to have fun. You can stay for at least one more round." It was clear that this was an order, not a request. He said, "Why don't you pour yourself and your wife a drink while I escort the lady to the dance floor?" He made a sweeping bow, like something out of a 19th century film, and said, "Shall we dance, my lady?" Becky giggled drunkenly and said, "Of course, good sir," and the two of them disappeared among the swirling couples. I headed towards the bar as quickly as I could. I didn't want to leave Becky in Osborne's clutches any longer than necessary. Thoughts about promotion have long been replaced by unbridled distrust of Govnyuk and his intentions. Ivan Patterson walked with me. He was the only one in the group I knew who was a decent guy. He said carefully, "You better be careful. Osborne is after your wife. I've seen him do this before, and he rarely takes no for an answer." I said firmly, "Becky is not like that." Patterson said, "She may not be like that, but Osborne will make her like that." His henchman kept refilling her glass all night. It's an old trick called boil the frog. Never let the level get too low. It gave me goosebumps. Becky was too polite to refuse if someone offered her a refill. I said, "So that's why he was stalling. In my entire life, I've never seen Becky act like this. This must have been a planned and coordinated attempt to get her to drink. I wondered what would happen if she actually crossed the line. My wife has always been so disciplined and controlled, but I knew Tiffin Ellerian was lurking somewhere in the background. It seemed impossible that Becky would let her slip, but I've also never seen her so drunk. As I was returning with the drinks, I noticed them both on the dance floor. Osborne held both hands directly above my wife's firm ass, pulling her towards him. She had a dreamy expression on her face, her arms wrapped tightly around his neck, her chest pressed against him, and her head resting intimately on his chest. She looked lost. A hitherto unthinkable thought occurred to me. "She will be his if he wants," I said out loud. "No, this won't happen. Not here." Handed the drinks to Patterson, went out onto the dance floor, and patted the colonel on the shoulder. There was a big difference in rank between us, so I had to behave politely. I said with a fake friendly smile, "Now it's my turn to dance with my wife, sir." Osborne gave me a grin and said, "Perhaps we should let the lady decide," he said softly, still rocking next to her. "Who do you want to dance with, my dear?" Without saying anything, Becky simply pressed herself closer to him. She was clearly drunk and reacted instantly, but it was a very erotic gesture. Her choice was obvious. The asshole said with a grin, "Well, I think that's your answer." Then, without saying another word, he spun her around in a dance. I stood there for ages with a broken heart. Then I realized that the entire staff of Osborne's hangers-on was watching me with undisguised glee. Their hero dominated again. It made them all feel strong and courageous. Of course, Osborne made sure that Becky was not himself before he made his move. And, more importantly, he was absolutely sure that I would end up in the punishment cell if I hit a superior officer. We had a world of uniform code of military justice, not civil law. I'm blind with rage. Some people might storm out of this place, or they might sit there and sulk. But this is the digital age, where the main predators are hackers, and IMAO, shithead needed a harsh lesson in morals and good manners. So I decided right then and there to nuke his arrogant ass. I know this reaction doesn't make sense, but when you get angry, you do stupid things. I needed a little time to pull all the necessary levers, so I went to a secluded window alcove, scanned Osborne's smartphone, and dropped the flying monkey on him. What? Doesn't everyone have hacker malware on their phones? Now I had unlimited access to calls, SMS, photos, contacts list, even his bank account. Everything a busy person keeps on his mobile phone. Moreover, I could control its camera and recording functions. So I was in his pocket. Literally. By the time I got everything ready, he and my wife had finished their dance. The asshole brought the easily controlled Becky back to the group and said cheerfully, "It was easier than I thought." One of them said, "What a weakling." He simply disappeared with his tail between his legs. Everyone present had a good laugh at this, which only strengthened my intention to go with shit to the end. He had a very bad day ahead of him. The boys joked for a long time. Then the moment came. Osborne turned to my wife and said in a falsely encouraging tone, "You don't look well, darling. Let's go up to my room and you can lie down for a minute." This made my hair stand on end. I stopped organizing the demise of Asshole and began to closely monitor what was happening to Becky. She mumbled something like, "Maybe it's worth it. I have difficulty standing on my feet. I've never been so drunk." This was clearly Tiffin talking. I immediately went into alert number 1. When shit took Becky by the hand and led her into the lobby, massive fun began among the military contingent. My wife swayed slightly as she followed, but the sway of her hips showed that Tiffin was now in the house. With a sinking heart, I realized that Osborne was going to get a lot more sex than he bargained for unless I did something quickly. I didn't want to make a fool of myself by trying to get physically involved again. It was a rank issue, and I've already seen what it led to, so I needed to have leverage. I frantically hacked into the hotel's management system while sneaking behind them. It took a minute for my fluttering fingers to trigger the continuation injection needed to get the room number. At this time, I heard the elevator door ring. In the entire time it took them to walk the length of the marble hall, they did not say a word. But when the doors closed, I heard rustling and some sounds. Then my wife moaned with lust. She was clearly in heat, and it just broke my heart. To be honest, I was planning on ending their little tryst before anything fatal happened. I knew all it would take to get the asshole to back down were incriminating photographs. But the hotel's keycard system was on a different server, and by the time I unlocked the door, Tiffin Ilarion was already in control. Overconfidence is the fatal flaw of a nerd, and I was getting too close to it. They were in such a hurry that they even left the light on. I hated myself. All I could see of Becca was her face, contorted in a mask of delight, and her bare arms and legs tightly closed around Asshole. The room was full of wet slapping sounds and the smell of sex. She shouted, "Oh, Lord! Yes! Like this! Yes!" She then appeared to lose consciousness. I recorded this entire action, but then I saw that Govnyuk had put his own phone on the bedside table and was also recording what was happening. Since it was also streamed to my cloud account, I had everything in glorious 1080p from 2 different angles. I didn't need the phone right now, so I put it on the dresser and started clapping my hands slowly. It took a second of applause because Shithead was busy with my wife. However, he eventually realized that there was someone else in the room. Frightened, he rolled over onto his back and looked around. His amazement and horror were almost worth my pain. He tried to jump to his feet, but instead he caught his feet in the blanket and tumbled off my wife, landing face first next to the bed. This would be an invaluable comedy if it were not such a deep tragedy. Becky lay there, covered in sweat, legs grotesquely spread wide, in a dead sleep. It was a completely humiliating sight. The asshole, stumbling awkwardly, rose to his feet and shouted, "Give it up!" I started recording again. He realized that he was in deep trouble. I laughed and said bitterly, "I will give it to you at your Section 134 hearing." Then he added sarcastically, "Sir!" I turned on my heel, walked out the door, and down the hallway to the elevator. The asshole ran into the corridor in a panic. Then I realized that he was completely naked. I turned around and captured the sight for posterity. He shouted in disappointment, "Crap!" and returned to the room. I took the elevator to the lobby and bought a beer at the hotel restaurant. Anger is a cleansing emotion. It burns away weaker ones, such as indecision and self-pity. It also helps one get through impossible situations, such as losing a happy life. I had a plan and began to take the steps necessary to reclaim my manhood. The first thing I did was post Asshole's financial information to a few select dark web message boards. It was like throwing a delicious baby goat into a pool full of piranhas. I assumed that in the next 5 to 10 seconds, his financial situation would radically change thanks to Onion Rooter and the inhabitants of the Silk Road, an online trading platform in the zone. Onion of the anonymous Tor network. Then he sent out a short edited video to everyone on his contact list. The subject of the letter read, "Look who I'm having sex with. This should grab people's attention." I wondered what his wife and priest would think when they reproduced the investment. I used asshole's own phone number to send the message because I didn't want to be accused of an illegal revenge video. I would publish this entire terrible meeting. But due to POP3 SMTP limitations, attachments must be short. If I included the entire entry, it would be filtered out at the recipient's gateway. Luckily, there are no restrictions on what you can upload to adult websites. So I posted both posts there. I arrived late to their party. But Govnyuk's phone captured this whole wretched mess. The sex was so hot that he might even make back some of the money he's currently losing on Deep Web. I then sent a short, edited video with a carefully worded explanation to every media outlet I could think of. MSNBC, CNN, Post, Times, Fox, and One America. Revenge is not political, and this was the kind of red meat guaranteed to unleash the hounds of the Fourth Estate. The message was short and concise. It explained who Osborne was, the context of what they were seeing, and the national security implications. Finally, it warned that I expected the army to try to cover it all up. This part of the message was probably my only chance of not ending up in Leavenworth Military Prison. Now all I had left was a lonely walk to the parking lot and a long, sad drive home. I'm a nerd, and nerds don't cry. We are too rational, or perhaps weird is a better word for human emotions. But Baker's betrayal, as involuntary as it was so painful that I may have squeezed a drop or two out of myself. It was 3:15 a.m. when the first bell rang. I sat in my small home office getting things in order. It was Sharp. Without preamble, he said, "The colonel is ready to forget about your insubordination if you give him everything you wrote down. There's nothing wrong with your wife. She's just sleeping it off." I said cheerfully, "It's too late. She's already everywhere." He had no idea how everywhere it was. People unfamiliar with the cyber domain do not understand virtuality, its pervasive reach, and instantaneous time frame. These possibilities simply do not match their ideas of what is possible. Sharp, sputtering, asked, "What do you mean everywhere?" I said, "You'll see," and hung up. There might have been a final confrontation with Rebecca. That is, after she sobers up and drags her sorry ass home. But the army was ahead of her. They started knocking on my door at 4:25, and I found 3 military policemen standing on the porch. They took me to Fort McNair in the city. Not a word was said during the entire hour drive. They parked me in a small room at 3rd Division headquarters, where I was still cooling my heels at 6:30 when the 2-star guy showed up, along with Osborne, Sharp, Wysocki, and one of the captains. A fight without rules began. The guy with the 2 stars, whose name tag said mid, as in the name of the fort, said, "Stand up, soldier!" It was supposed to remind me where I am and who is in charge here. I stood at attention, and the guy walked around me, not taking his eyes off me. Finally, he said with a threat in his voice, "Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you got yourself into? Drunkenness, insubordination, and striking a senior in rank? That's all." I said in an even tone, "I deny it. Sir, my only crime was catching Colonel Osborne having sex with my wife." Osborne growled, "I told you that's what he'll say." I said, keeping my voice level and respectful, "I have half a dozen witnesses to this seduction." Osborne laughed and said, "Did you see anything, boys? They vying with each other to deny that they had seen anything at that very moment. To damn." A call came to the general's mobile phone. It was almost too unbelievable, like God ex machina, but it actually happened. The general, having gone through a series of uh-huhs, suddenly shouted shrilly, "What?" He turned to Osborne and said, "The Washington Post just contacted the Pentagon Press Service to ask about the cover-up of a sex scandal involving you. They say they have proof. Hallelujah. The Gray Lady of 15th Street was at it." Osborne looked like he was about to have a stroke. He turned bright red and spluttered, "Where did they get this from?" I calmly said, "I sent your post to several news organizations. I thought they might be interested. Perhaps he even mentioned that the army would try to hide it. Now it looked like they were both about to faint. Isn't revenge a bitch? The whole group, as one, turned and ran out of the room. I still had the bug on Asshole's phone, so I eavesdropped on their conversation. I heard Meade say in a voice full of rage, "What the hell, Osborne? Why can't you keep it in your pants? How much do they know?" Osborne spoke as if he were being strangled. He has a recording of me and his wife. Somehow he managed to get it to the Post. I have no idea how he did it. But he's one of the idiots in 780. The general said decisively, "Enough for me. Get out yourself. Stay away from the press until I decide what to do with you and your 3 cronies." Oh my, Shit's henchmen also seemed to be getting theirs, just like their boss. Meade added, "I'll go there now and sort everything out. In the meantime, I want you boys," he must have been addressing the military police, "to escort these 4 back to their quarters in the barracks and make sure they stay there." When the general came back in, I made a polite face. He looked gloomy as he said, "There are 2 options for the development of events. Either we make your life in the military hell, or you sign a non-disclosure agreement stating that you know nothing about anything and repeat it to the press until it's all over. In this case, you will retire with the rank of major with all the benefits." He stopped, looked at me menacingly, and added, "What do you choose?" So the gist of my sad story was that by 10 o'clock in the morning, I left Fort McNair with an active reserve contract as a retired major and a good discharge with a large government pension. I also got the impression that Meade was considering whether the Army might reintroduce flogging as a punishment for shithead. Even better, Osborne was now penniless. No matter what the Army did to him, his career was over, and his wife would file for divorce. It was a delightful topic to think about. This is what happens when you get involved with someone with my particular skill set. I would have laughed in the bastard's face, but he was confined to his home. Bouah, haha. Now about the most difficult part. I had to think things through before talking to my wife. I had been running on adrenaline for a while now, and it took me a while to realize what had just happened. Thank God Becky was still passed out when the military police dropped me off at the house. I collected some of my things and left a note. It said, "It takes me a while to digest everything. Don't try to contact me until I'm ready." I even signed it, "With love," which matched my feelings. Then he jumped into his Ford F-150 pickup truck and headed to the boat. It was still only 11:30 a.m. The island packet is a cruiser, not a racer. Therefore, it looks and feels like a compact luxury apartment with all the amenities. I planned to live there all the time. Now I had nothing to do. I unpacked the things I had brought and sat on the deck, watching the happy people fly off on their weekend adventures. And then it was like I had a heart attack. It will never be me again. As a Draenei paladin, I have overcome insurmountable odds. Justice has been served, and the godless have been defeated. By all rights, I should feel very good. So why did I want to tie an anchor around my neck and jump off the transom? Because the only true jewel in my life had been desecrated, and there was no turning back. I mean, I get it, I really get it. Beneath all her nerdiness, Becky was a passionate woman, Osborne was an attractive man, and her sex with him had been a carefully planned and executed seduction on his part. However, the problem wasn't that my wife was writhing under Osborne in ecstasy. I knew that his henchmen had poured enough alcohol into her to weaken her restraint and fatally impair her sanity. The problem was the action leading up to the event, when she clung so closely to Shithead after he asked her to choose. This was the real betrayal. Every couple relies on the confidence that your other half will choose you and not someone else. This gives an innate trust in the exclusivity of your marriage. When Becky instinctively clung to Shitty, I had clear evidence that my assumptions were not entirely correct. Accordingly, while I could forgive Becky for her transgression, I simply could not accept that she chose someone else. The call came shortly after 2 o'clock. Apparently, she had finally sobered up. I replied in irritation, "Which part of the phrase, 'don't mess with me,' didn't you understand?" Some time passed, and she said with tears in her voice, "Oh God, Eric, "I am so sorry," I said as kindly as I could. "I know it's true. But that doesn't change what happened. I need time to think things through," she said, still crying. "You're on a yacht, aren't you?" "Yes, and I want to sit here and decide what I think about what just happened." "You need to stay where you are. I will return home when everything is settled and we can discuss our next steps. Until then, just stay away." She pathetically begged me. "Oh, please forgive me. I was so drunk. I know it must be terrible. I feel so achaved. You saw Tiffany doing it, not me," I said, letting anger creep into my voice. "No, my dear, it was still you. Let's stop fooling ourselves. I shouldn't have let you make this up. Tiffin is just your way of avoiding responsibility for your own actions. Now we have to live with the consequences," she said sadly. "You hate me?" "God, no. I love you with all my heart, that's the problem, but I'm not sure I can get through this. Give me a couple of days to think about it and we can talk again." She said pitifully, "I love you, and I will always love you." Unfortunately, we never talked. The problem was that Becca had top-secret S5 clearance, so when word got out that she was the woman now dominating the news cycle, she instantly became persona non grata at the fort. I should have realized this would happen when I made her little prank public, but I didn't. It was one of those split-second decisions that just seemed like a good idea at the time. Well, that is, I wanted to give the asshole a huge portion of shit, but he didn't intend to ruin Becca's life, which he did anyway, smearing her betrayal all over the internet. Admission has a lifestyle component. This is how it should be when working in national security. This is because compromising a lifestyle gives the enemy leverage, and the NSA already had too many Snowdens, Martins, and foes. As a result, Becca's security clearance was immediately revoked, and she was put on the next C-37 flight east to Iraq without any severance pay. This all happened the week after the Christmas party. My wife's disappearance allowed the NSA to rescue her from the clutches of the press, but that was not their real motive. Their real purpose was to provide an object lesson to any other nerd who might consider doing something equally stupid. Becca's transfer took effect immediately and was not subject to appeal. The only other option was prison. All this was provided for in the contract she signed, and in its effect was no different than if I had raised my right hand and taken the oath. Because the press went berserk, Becky wasn't even given the opportunity to contact me or anyone else. It was assumed that she would be able to contact me from her new duty station in the Green Zone. That is, after the media finds another squirrel to chase, being suddenly sent east may seem like extreme punishment. But that was nothing compared to what happened to Osborne. He was demoted 2 ranks to major and transferred to the reserve. It was especially pleasant to think that I had overtaken him in seniority in the rank of major, because I had been transferred to the reserve a few months before him. Of course, it didn't matter that Becca wasn't allowed to make contact while she was being stuffed into a box and sent away, because I've been living in a bubble all this time. My phone was turned off and I didn't look at the internet. Consequently, he had no idea what was going on in the world at large. It took a full 14 days before I was ready to talk again, but my calls kept going to voicemail. It was very painful. A merciless thought came to my mind. This little cheater is with shit. That's why I was especially shocked when 2 grim-faced civilians appeared in my life. By January standards, it was a beautiful day in the Chesapeake, sunny, with temperatures above 10, and I was now a man of leisure. I was happily sipping my hot coffee and reading the Post when a state car pulled into the marina parking lot. You know, that gray, minimally trimmed 4-door Ford sedan. This sight sharply intensified my attention. 2 gentlemen in black tailcoats got out of the car and asked the head of the pier a question. He pointed at me, and the 2 of them walked along the dock towards my boat. I got a very bad feeling. Perhaps there will still be a retaliatory strike from the army. 2 men in black walked carefully along the pier. I thought to myself, these guys don't go out often. I stepped towards them as they approached my pier and asked warily, "How can I help you, gentlemen?" The eldest of them showed a certificate that stated that he was an inspector in the police detachment at Fort Meade. He said in a neutral tone, "We need to talk to you, sir." I gestured to the benches on the deck of my boat and said, How about here? Or do you want to do it inside? The person who introduced himself said, "It's better inside." I led them along the ladder and into the inside of the boat. They looked in admiration at all the wood and brass parts. I asked, "Coffee?" And they both nodded in agreement. I poured 3 mugs and sat down on the bench opposite where they sat. I said, "Is it because of the army?" My dismissal may have been a little abrupt, but it was honorable. I can't believe there could be a problem with this now. Both looked at each other. The older one said, "The question concerns your wife, sir." That was the last thing I wanted to hear. I was already in conflict. I didn't need a federal agency involved in my divorce. I said with bitterness, because the injustice of it all had been gnawing at me for a long time. "I don't want to talk to her yet, and in general, why should you interfere in personal affairs?" The speaker said a little too firmly, "I need you to listen to me carefully, sir." Then he paused, collected his thoughts, and continued in a neutral tone. "I'm very sorry to tell you this, but your wife Rebecca has died." I just stared at him, thinking about that puzzling word. "Dead? What do you mean, not alive?" This can't be true. God couldn't let all that vitality, intelligence, and good humor go to waste. I said in confusion, "Did you just say that my wife died? How can this be? It just doesn't fit in my head." The guy said softly, "Your wife was flying on an Army C-37 plane that was supposed to refuel at Decimomana in Sardinia. We don't know what happened, but it disappeared from Seville's air surveillance radar somewhere east of Mallorca. It was night, and the weather in the area was very bad. But we don't have an exact explanation. We may never get it." I sat silently with my mouth open and looked at them. We all like to think that we are in control of our lives, until something comes and shows us how infinitely small and fleeting our moment is. Becca's death completely annulled my existence. I stared blankly into space. Everything inside me was pounding furiously. Becca's cheating hurt me, and I thought I might not be able to stay married to her. This remained to be seen, but it never occurred to me that in the future she would not be part of my world. This thought was too heavy for me. The second guy said quietly, "I am Father William, from the Chaplain Corps, if you want to be free of your burden, my son." I looked at him, still not understanding anything, and said with a painful howl, "Why?" I knew why. He knew why. Shit happens and no one is special. But this did not make the pain any less. Now I was completely alone and completely devastated. It scared me to death. My life, in fact, my entire reality, changed in a month. 30 days before, I was content and happy with a woman who was absolutely my soulmate. Now I was a widower whose dead wife had cheated on him in a painful and public way. But wait, the roller coaster ride isn't over yet. Obviously, there could not be a funeral since the plane Becky was flying on was somewhere at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. Instead, we held a memorial service in the chapel at the fort. Very few people gathered. My ancestors came from Frankfurt, which is in Michigan, not Germany. She came from Old Westbury, in Nassau County. Becky was their only child. Needless to say, my wife was from a privileged class. My old man owned a hardware store. Becca's father was doing something with a lot of money in Manhattan. However, her parents were the salt of the earth, which probably explained why their daughter was such a decent and humble person. There were a lot of tears and hugs. While giving the eulogy, I tried to keep myself together, but from time to time I had to pause to rub my eyes. Damn allergies. I made no mention of my wife's remarkable IQ or her many successes in the world of mathematics. Instead, I talked about her sunny disposition, sweet personality, and love of animals. Both sets of parents were staying in Baltimore, so we held the memorial dinner at Capitol Grill. It was a little too close to my personal apocalypse for my liking. But I wasn't going to mention the reason Becky was on that plane unless it came out later through official channels. She will always be the shining light that all who celebrated her life knew her to be. I was sitting next to Becca's father, who, as I said, was a major player in the money markets. We always got along, mainly because he only saw the form and not the nerd inside. He was just keeping the conversation going when he asked me what I was planning to do now. To me, it was like asking, excluding that Mrs. Lincoln, "How did you like the play?" But we both suffered a great loss. So, instead of my usual smart answer, I respectfully answered him, "I'm now discharged from the Army, and I'm thinking of doing what I've been working on for the last dozen years on a commercial basis." He seemed slightly interested, asking, "And what is it?" I talked about my little device and how I thought it could change the world. Maybe I sounded too enthusiastic and weirdly technical, but he caught the part that said it could be paired with almost any other device to give it a human appearance. He said, "Let me sum it up. Do you have a computer program that can make everyday things behave as if they were alive?" This was not entirely true, but close enough. I said, "Essentially, it allows another device to do something based on what it sees and learns, just like a human would do. For example, your refrigerator will know to reorder milk before it runs out, or your TV will be able to turn on your favorite show without having to use the remote." He said, "It's a nice everyday thing, like Alexa or Siri, but I don't see how it will change the world." I said, "How about installing it in a network so it can reliably identify and deal with an intruder in real time without human intervention? Or installing it in a production robot where the device could improve the job it does? Or in a rocket, capable of reaching a target as if it were controlled by a person?" He looked at me in surprise and asked, "Can your invention do this?" I laughed. "It learns and does the same thing as the person performing the task. At the same time, it does everything at machine speed, does not get tired, does not make mistakes, and does not forget." He looked at me shrewdly and said, "How do you plan to bring it to market?" I laughed again and said, "I know everything there is to know about artificial intelligence, but I know nothing about marketing. How would you advise me to approach this?" He said mysteriously, "Why don't you talk to some of my people and maybe we can come up with some ideas." Baker's father turned out to be a man of action. A guy named Philip contacted me early Monday morning, and by Tuesday I was on the Acela train for the 3-hour ride into Manhattan. The meeting took place in one of those canyon buildings on Wall Street. Philip was a frighteningly young fellow, about my age, and clearly a prominent figure in Becca's father's company. He led me into a room with a lot of glass windows and a long table. There were 4 others whose names I didn't remember, only their roles. Most of them were marketers, and one was a nerd. He and I were the only ones not wearing dark blue suits with the obligatory red tie. I sat nervously in the back of the room. Philip came forward and said, "Eric is Rebecca Spencer's ex-husband. He spoke to her father at her funeral and mentioned that he had a device that could make ordinary things learn. So he asked him to come up here so we could explain and evaluate it. Isn't that right, Eric?" I looked out the window in surprise at a helicopter flying at about the same altitude at which I was sitting, and therefore missed his words. I realized it was time to speak only when I noticed a significant pause, and that everyone was staring at me. I asked, puzzled, "What did you just say, Philip?" He pretended to be patient, as if he were talking to a second grader, and said, "I told our Tiger team that you have a device that reflects human thinking." I said carefully, "I headed the Cyber Operations Division at Fort Meade, where I created an AI that heuristically monitors networks for intrusions. In my free time, as a hobby, I expanded it to mirror general human cognition. It can be connected to most digital devices to give them basic thinking and learning abilities that are essentially human-like." The whole table looked at me as if they thought I was deceiving them. I spent the rest of the day proving that this was not the case. By the end of the meeting, the entire group, especially their house botanist, was jumping up and down with anticipation. By this time, it was already dark. Philip said, "We want to discuss this among the team members, and we will be able to finalize the proposal by tomorrow. Why don't we grab something to eat and we can put you up for the night? It was certainly better than returning to my lonely home." Besides, I had nothing to do, so I said, "Certainly." Philip and a botanist named Bobby took me to the Eurostar on the East River and checked me in. Then we were taken to Harry's Steakhouse in Hanover Square for a casual business dinner for $500. It was obvious that the plan was to get me one-on-one with Bobby and see if I really knew my stuff. So we drank a couple of bottles of excellent Cabernet and talked. This conversation apparently answered all of Bobby's concerns, because around 10 o'clock that evening, Philip, apparently using Dad's credit card, suggested we end the evening at Flash Dancers on Murray. Winking at me. I had no idea what that meant, and I don't think Bobby either. We were both nerds, and nerds don't know anything about smelly clubs. But Philip, of course, knew. He walked confidently inside, and Bobby and I hid behind him, looking around as if we were afraid that someone would recognize Ease. I must admit that this is a stylish establishment. The decor is high class, like in an expensive gentleman's establishment. The gorgeous waitresses are all wearing masks, according to New York rules, and not much else. If you didn't pay attention to the loud music and two super fit girls performing very difficult exercises on poles at the end of the hall, you might not have guessed that this was a strip club. There were several reasons why I didn't want to be there. First of all, nerds are too damn shy to enjoy being surrounded by mostly naked women plying their trade next to you like it's a Denny's restaurant. But more importantly, I was still not even close to recovering from Becca's betrayal and death, and the atmosphere of this place raised a million annoying and unresolved questions. So I sat there for no more than 5 minutes, when the carnal madness going on around me and the implicit sinful atmosphere just overwhelmed me, and I began to sob. It was too much, and it was also the single most shameful and humiliating moment in my life. Bobby, who suffered from the same social disadvantages as me, reacted as if I had vomited on the table. Philip looked at me with some contempt, but mostly it was irritation, because I was interfering with his progress with the waitress. He asked Bobby, should I take him back to the hotel? As we sat in the taxi, I told my new friend my sad story. Bobby was like me, so I was absolutely sure that the last thing he wanted to hear about was any aspect of my personal life, but I just had to explain myself. He muttered something like, I understand, but I knew that wasn't true. It would take walking a mile in my shoes to understand how damaged my current psychological landscape was. In fact, I was close to deciding that there was no point in living anymore. Then, the next day, the roller coaster took me one more turn. The gist of our conversation was that whoever Becca's father represented wanted my little invention and was willing to pay for it. The amount they were willing to pay was unbelievable. So I had one last meeting with my ex-father-in-law before I boarded the Acela train at Penn Station. He had a conversation corner filled with expensive leather furniture in an office that was slightly larger than my small home. It was difficult to relax. But I was a stranger in a strange land, and I needed someone to rely on. His daughter was a decent person. I expected him to be like that too. I asked him, no, more like begged him, to help me. I said I was grieving so much that I couldn't think straight. Besides, I'm a nerd, not a businessman. I don't have the slightest idea how to act wisely. He looked at me in such a way that I realized that I had finally found a common language with him. He loved his daughter. Obviously, I loved her too. He said, don't worry, Eric. You are still part of the family. I'll handle this for you if you trust me enough to give me power of attorney. You can just live your life and try to make sense of what happened. This conversation became the next radical turning point in my life. Becca's father was like a father to me. He called a month later to say that my little invention had been bought by a big player for 9 figures, and that coupled with licensing income had made me rich beyond my wildest dreams. It's always like this in technology. Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, even SpaceX all started with a nerd and a good idea. Then, a decade later, they were led by packs of plutocrats in a dastardly competition to become the richest man in the world. In my case, the only question for Mr. Spencer was, will you do this for me? I was serious. What did I know about money? So, plunged into the abyss of despair, I soared to the heights of great wealth. All this lasted from mid-December to early March. In just 3 months, I went from an ordinary person to a nerd with unlimited wealth. It was a completely unimaginable turn, as if I had won the lottery. The change in circumstances was justifiably upsetting. You must understand. I worked on my gadget out of simple intellectual curiosity. Botanists are like that. We don't think about money or even need it. Now I was rich beyond belief. It took a lot of midnight thinking to figure out what it was. The strong change in mental temperature almost broke me. The irony was that money was now a cruel joke. After all, what could I spend it on? The only thing of real value is gone forever. And botanists, like the wolf, the swan, and the humble seahorse, mate for life. 3 years have passed. During this time, the only significant change was that I sold our house and moved from the USA. I had to do it to keep my sanity. I knew I would commit suicide if I didn't get away from everything that reminded me of Becky. At least the money allowed me to do it. The goal was to separate my old life from my new circumstances as much as possible. Sort of like a factory reset. I wanted to clear my mind of any reminders of my love. I did some research called Where You Can Go Away from the Ring Road and ended up in Port Isaac on the Cornish coast. It could just as easily have been any other remote place. But I half understood the native language there. Port Isaac is a neat fishing village with a rural feel where I could sit and contemplate the ocean and try to heal. When I arrived, at first I was just as depressed as at home. But the amazingly simple people, their life in the pub, and the friends I made there helped me get out of it. However, Port Isaac is on the Atlantic side of the Cornish Peninsula. Therefore, the weather there is the same as in Ireland, that is, a lot of rain. I really enjoyed the social atmosphere of the place, but 3 years later, the gray days made my depression worse. I understood that it was the height of hypocrisy to continue to play Hamlet when fortune smiled at me so openly generously. Now I had all the time in the world and an endless amount of money, and I thought I could move to the sun-drenched Mediterranean. I think you understand why I wanted to go there. Firstly, it was always sunny and hot there. But more importantly, my wife lay lost in the depths of the sea somewhere east of Mallorca. This is the place where I was drawn. For this, I bought Hylas 44. Its body was royal blue rather than the traditional white because I like the solid look the color gives. The upper decks and planking were white or mahogany, and the aluminum mast gleamed in the sun. Hylas is a single-masted cruiser with boat rigging. The fit-out and fittings are all ultra-high class, and the luxury of wood and brass below deck is a true tour de force. There is a gallery lounge with exceptional living space and a true stateroom. This is not easy for a solo traveler, but I wasn't worried about not being able to handle her. The Hylas was only a couple of meters longer than my old packet, and in this class, I was an expert. The sails were controlled by roller furlers, which took all the weight, and I had an autopilot. But tuning a boat correctly requires skill and a keen eye. After I added all the navigation equipment, generator, air conditioning, and propulsion for the sails, the yacht cost over $1 million. But if I'm alone, I'll need all this for safety. On a hot sunny day, I picked up the yacht from the Yacht Marine office in Barcelona's Marina Port Vell. I completed all the paperwork at the embankment with my new girlfriend. We met when I was in England. She was slender and gorgeous, with huge green eyes and an arrogant personality that reeked of grandeur. At first she acted aloof, but I was patient with her, and now she was completely devoted to me. She walked around our new house, looking at everything with contempt. Then she made a lightning movement and reappeared with a mouse in her mouth, which was quite appropriate since Bastet is a cat. Well, actually, technically she's not a cat. She belongs to an older breed of cat called Mao, from Egyptian cat. Mao are descendants of African wildcats. It is these creatures that are found in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. She is slightly larger than a house cat and has a strange spotted coat that suggests her origins are closer to the cheetah. I love dogs. They are always your friends. But dogs on boats have a hygiene problem. There is no such problem with cats, and as a bonus, cats get rid of unwanted stowaways. I named her Bastet after the Egyptian goddess of war. It's a fitting name as she is a wild little creature who seems to view our relationship as a hunting partnership rather than a master and pet one. Bastet and I talk a lot. She's Egyptian, so she has an exotic accent. But when I get sentimental, she's not afraid to tell the truth. He looks at me with his ancient eyes and hisses, "I cannot hunt with such a weak companion. You must be better, my brother." Maybe I'm just talking to myself. But Bastet speaks very wisely. I left Barcelona Harbor on a sunny July day, heading south-southeast using the satellite navigation's built-in autonomous steering. I was aiming for the Balearic Islands because that was the area where Becca's plane crashed. I was hoping to find out something more about it there. Too pretentious, I suppose. I just wanted to be near the place of her death. I was haunted by the thought of her last minutes of horror when the plane was falling. Plus, I needed a short route to identify all the problems with my brand new boat. Sailboats are like women. You need to know their quirks if you want to have a good marriage. My destination was the city of Palma on the island of Majorca. It is the largest of the Balearic Islands, approximately 120 miles from Barcelona Harbor. I was on port tack and sailing into a strong westerly wind with full mainsail and staysail, making almost 9 knots. You don't experience such sensations on any other type of transport, except, perhaps, a motorcycle. The island has impressive mountains on its northern side, and by late evening, it began to emerge from the haze on the southeastern horizon. Just before sunset, I rounded the western tip of the island and dropped anchor in the marina of Palma, 14 hours after setting sail. Hylas and I fell in love with each other. The night was beautiful, with a soft, magical breeze and the sounds of the small town of Palma in the background. At 9 o'clock in places like Spain, it's dinner time, and I've seen herds of tourists milling around the city. Memories of the only person I cared about came flooding back to me, and I began to grieve for the millionth time. Bastet lay on the combing of the companionway hatch and looked at me the way cats do. She is a fierce little beast, and there is no peace in her wild soul. She hissed contemptuously, "You need to stop thinking about the past, brother. This is weakness. Strong hunters only think about their next kill." Of course she was right. Everyone wants to see themselves as strong and effective. This is a matter of personal pride, and I have been out of my mind for a long time. I couldn't continue to behave this way and retain any dignity or self-respect. Therefore, I decided to speak out against it right here and now. The fact is that it is impossible to change the past. You can only do your best in the present. In an incredibly short period of time, I experienced a series of powerful blows. From the seduction of my wife, her subsequent death, and then the ridiculous changes in my personal situation. It broke my inner gyroscope. I had no peace of mind. Now I was determined to turn things around and enjoy my newfound status as a fabulously wealthy man. This was to begin the next morning. I sat on the deck with a Cuban cigar, a habit I picked up once I got used to a limitless supply of cash, and Googled 5-star hotels. I woke up to a bright and hot July day. I booked a suite at the Palacio Can Marquez, which was about a 10-minute walk from where I docked. This hotel was considered the best in Majorca. I asked 6T to deliver a BMW 8 Series convertible to the hotel, but I wanted to get there on foot from the yacht. Therefore, I strolled through the honeyed streets of the old town of Palma, enjoying the atmosphere. I was dragging a suitcase on rollers. A large spotted cat was prowling next to me. Baste insists on walking next to me. She thinks we're looking for prey, which, in a way, we probably were. People tried hard not to stare. Bastet hissed, "What's the matter with these people? Maybe I should kill someone so they don't look at us." She didn't say it out loud, but I knew that was what she was thinking. Bastet doesn't actually know that he only weighs 11 kilograms. The receptionist didn't bat an eyelid when Bastet came in with me. He might have said something if I was renting a room for less than $800 a night. But the staff at the Palacio Hotel are accustomed to the whims of their wealthy clients. The room was decorated in dark wood, cream plaster, and immaculate tiles, overlooking the busy Carrer de la Punta d'Ors street below. Bastet looked around the room with her usual condescension and found it moderately pleasant. Then she climbed out onto the balcony and lay there with her tail between her legs, looking like a jaguar in a tree. I told her, "No falling on unsuspecting passers-by." I was joking. The street was about 14 meters away, but Bastille looked at me with her typical green-eyed gaze and said, "It all depends on how tasty they look." I think she really believed it. I laughed, then closed the door and went downstairs to have lunch in the hotel courtyard. The mashed avocado and egg toast were exactly as delicious as I imagined, and the cold San Miguel was refreshing. I was idly thinking about my life and the future when I began to experience a strange sensation. It was an ominous rumble, like an eerie increase in wind before a rapidly approaching thunderstorm. I looked around for the cause, and it hit me like a tornado hits a trailer park in Topeka. My wife Rebecca just came out onto the terrace. Of course she was dead. Can you imagine the parade of emotions running through my mind? At first there was a slight realization, I know this woman. Then, complete disbelief when I realized where I knew her. Then came a stunned feeling of the complete unreality of what was happening. Okay, then, tell me, how would you react? I finally accepted that the love of my life was gone forever and committed myself to building my life without her. And then, just at the moment when I decided to do this, God takes away the soccer ball. I was already starting to get tired of all these ups and downs. You might think I was sane for the next few minutes. If so, then you are very mistaken. In fact, I was convinced that I was crazy. Think about it. You would assess the situation calmly, or you would be in a mortal blockade because your eyes were telling you something that your cerebral cortex judged to be untrue. In about 30 seconds, I went through 4 of the 5 stages of grief. At first, there was denial. You're an idiot. That's not her. This led to anger. Damn it! This is some cruel trick. Then came the bargaining. I'll live better if it's her. This was followed by depression. This just makes me so sad. There was no talk of acceptance. Oddly enough, the first thing that came to my mind was the improbability of the circumstances. I mean, to quote one guy in a bar in Casablanca, not far from where I was sitting, of all the gins in the world. But there were bigger questions, like why Rebecca was still alive and why she doesn't recognize me. So, as you can imagine, I felt a lot of emotions. Continued, as my brain reset and I felt more rational, I realized that there was no hint of recognition in Rebecca's eyes, even when she looked in my direction. You'd expect some kind of reaction from a woman who had just seen her long-lost husband, but there was nothing. She wasn't pretending. She didn't know who I was. This led to the next obvious question, namely, who is this guy she's with now? He was much older, and he had a seriousness about him that made me assume he was someone important, so maybe my waiter knows him. I made a barely noticeable gesture, and he quietly approached the table. 5-star waiters know how to be vigilant. I nodded towards my wife and said, I think I know this couple, but I can't remember their last name. You don't know who they are? The waiter laughed and said, Of course, senor, this is Dr. and Mrs. March Bretman. She is famous as the mysterious Lady of the Sea, and he is the director of the Psychiatrico Hospital in Palma. They often have lunch here. My God, Becky is married? I took a €100 bill out of the money clip and placed it on the table. The waiter glanced sideways at her and suddenly became a source of information. He said, Everyone in Palma knows their story. The doctor saved her life and then married her. It's very romantic, isn't it? Crap, I said, trying to keep my voice indifferent. Tell me about this story. The waiter said, The beautiful lady was saved by fishermen. She was found floating on a life raft in the open sea. We have no idea how she ended up in this place. She was there with 3 others. But she was the only one left alive. She was taken to hospital in Menorca. I knew that Menorca was an island northeast of Majorca, directly in the flight path from Andrews in Washington to Sardinia. This is where her plane was supposed to crash. I said with a slight hesitation in my voice, How badly was she hurt? She was wounded, senor. But the main problem was that she had been lying under the hot sun for some time without food or water and was not herself. Therefore, she was transferred to the Psychiatrico Hospital here. I said in horror, Not yourself? Gone mad? I guess floating in a life raft after a plane crash can do that to you." The waiter laughed and said, "No, sir. She is a very smart and kind lady. I myself had the pleasure of serving her several times. She just doesn't remember who she is and how she ended up where she was found. So Becky suffers from amnesia. I thought it was just a myth or a plot device. It is more pertinent to ask, how can someone with amnesia not be identified in this modern age? Someone somewhere must have a file on her." And then it dawned on me. Becca's security clearance required that anything identifying her be kept national security classified. This information could not be disclosed to anyone, especially if she inexplicably disappeared. So there was no way people in Mallorca could have accessed Becca's identity. I pushed the €100 bill towards the waiter, saying, "Thank you for the information," and he, as if by magic, made her disappear. He nodded demurely and went back to watching the other diners as they ate. As for me, I had been mourning the loss of my wife for 3 years, and suddenly she appeared, sitting no more than 6 meters in front of me. This might piss some people off, but I'm a nerd. And no matter how strange we may seem to normal people, in a stressful situation, nerds will always replace emotions with logic. If you need a reminder, remember the guy from Long Life and Riches. I analyzed the facts and accepted that the mysterious lady of the sea was indeed my wife, and that she did not remember anything from her life before the disaster. This goes without saying. I also understood why Becky fell in love with her doctor. She is a soulful person and naturally gravitated towards those who helped her. Of course, she was already married to me. But neither she nor her doctor knew about this. To be honest, I also had some questions about the ethics of a doctor marrying his patient, no matter how attractive she may be. But that had nothing to do with the current question, which was what I could do to return things to the way they were before I encountered her. The confounding variable was myself. I was still a nerd. I dressed like him and acted like him. But I was no longer the same person Becky knew. I was infinitely richer, perhaps the richest man on this island. Therefore, he could have done anything, including blowing off her current husband, if he wanted. But the one thing I was not going to do was try to seduce her. If she truly had amnesia, then any attempt to come between her and her husband would put me in the same category as Osborne, and I didn't consider myself that way. I've been through pain and I wouldn't do that to anyone. Thus, any attempts to lure the current Becky away from her second husband were rejected. Becca's fall was all shaky, and I always thought she was more of a prey than a hunter. This was true whether I decided to stay with her or not, but now it didn't matter. The woman I had already begun to think of as Rebecca 2.0 was a completely different person, and I had to approach the problem that way, even if she was technically still my Becky. I heard light laughter at her table. Becky loved to laugh. She hasn't changed a bit from the wonderful woman I knew and loved. Of course, there was one obvious exception. She lived on the island of Mallorca and was married to another man. I had a lot to think about and needed a lot more information before deciding what to do next. I signed the bill, stood up, and left the terrace. On the way, I had to pass by them. She looked at me, and I winked. For a moment, a shadow of confusion passed over her face, like a cloud crossing a prairie on a sunny day. Then she smiled joyfully and said, "Good morning." Becky always reacted this way to strangers passing by. I held myself tightly and continued walking. Opening the door to my room, I found Bastille on the sunny balcony, enjoying her second afternoon nap. Cats! I think, statistically, the average 12-year-old cat sleeps for 7 of those years. The room featured a wood-paneled office with an ornate desk. I cheerfully walked over to my laptop and Googled plane crash survivor. This was the first thing I needed to understand. Everything was on the internet. Menorca is even smaller than Mallorca. Therefore, the story of her rescue was covered only at the local level. However, at the time, it was a sensation. This is where the nickname Mysterious Lady of the Sea came from. They must have left the plane. The waiter said she was found floating in a life raft. She suffered from dehydration and sunburn and suffered a serious head injury. The coma she fell into may have saved her life because it lowered her metabolism to the point that she was still alive when the men in the fishing boat stumbled upon her. The long-term consequence of all this was retrograde amnesia. This was because she must have received a blow. This is a rare but not uncommon condition and is usually associated with traumatic brain injury, such as in a plane crash. This is like wiping a computer's memory without affecting its ability to process data. People suffering from this type of amnesia lose their previous life, but do not lose their basic abilities. So even though Becky spoke Spanish to her husband, I was willing to bet that she still spoke English and still had her remarkable IQ. People suffering from retrograde amnesia lose their most recent memories first. This may be permanent, or they may return over time. Therefore, Becky will probably never be able to remember that she was married or even that she graduated from college. But she was able to retain a few memories of her childhood. It's been 3 years now, so her memories of me are no doubt lost forever. I wondered what it would be like to remember that you grew up in the US, but your whole reality is rooted in Mallorca, Spain. This couldn't be pleasant. I guess that's what her new husband helped her deal with. I checked him too. Bretman was German. This was not strange, since it seems that half of this cold nation lives in Mallorca. He was a doctor and director of a psychiatric institute on the island. He was considerably older than both of us, 63 to Becky and I's 38, and he had a reputation as a highly respected doctor. I didn't blame him for falling in love with my wife. She is a magnificent creature, but this is the least of what comes from her. Her joy for life, easy spirit, intelligence, and inner strength would be exceptional qualities in any person. They were married for a little over 2 years. I wasn't even going to think about their life together. For more than 10 years, I enjoyed Becca's sweet love, lively communication, and outstanding erotic talents. Bretman was now the recipient of her bounty. I just couldn't go there and keep my sanity. I needed to make a decision. I saw that Becky was alive. Therefore, the simplest and perhaps most altruistic thing to do would be to sail to another place. Let her live the life of a Mallorcan aristocrat, not knowing about my existence, and I can live on, knowing that she is happy. So why did it seem so unfortunate? I told myself, what is the problem? You were almost certainly going to divorce her anyway. The problem was that I was still very much in love with her. I understand that this is a contradiction, but the complexity of emotions is that they do not obey the laws of physics. After all, 2 different feelings can simultaneously exist in the same space. The only thing I knew for sure was that this moment was critical in my life. I must make wise choices, or live the rest of my days consumed by regret. Bastei, who has a cat's ability to read minds, came and easily jumped onto my lap. I stroked her while she looked at me with huge green eyes and said, "She's yours, brother. You must not allow anyone else to take your spoils." Cats are absolutists. They cut through the bullshit and get to the core. Forget about what is good or bad. Becky is still my wife, and I can't just sail off into the sunset and leave her in the arms of another guy. Not if I want to maintain my manhood. I wasn't going to try to take her away from Bretman, if she chose him. But, just like that fateful night, I wanted an affirmative answer to the question, do you choose me? Unfortunately, for the sake of my conscience, I will have to do this without violating any of my own rules of righteous behavior. Perhaps I don't exist in Becca Tupino's world. If this is the case, then the right and honorable thing to do would be to leave her in her new life. However, all descriptions of retrograde amnesia state that victims regain their memories if exposed to the right stimuli. With the exception of one tragic day, Rebecca and I had a perfect love and marriage. So I thought it would be no big deal if I dangled it in front of her, just to see what I could get out. Fortunately, her maternal husband was a March Ordonez. March Ordonez was Francisco Franco's best friend and one of the leading fascist leaders in Spain. He was also the man who founded the dynasty that still controls much of Spanish banking, and the Juan March Museum is a Mallorca landmark. Perhaps March created it to buy some respectability, especially after the fall of Hitler and his fellow dictators. but it does contain one of the finest collections of 20th century Spanish art in the world. Be that as it may, my interest in this museum was due to the fact that Baker's husband was a member of its board. There are many branches of this family, and I doubted that the good doctor was a direct heir to the March Ordnance money, given his German surname. But the fact that part of his family name is embossed above the door means Bretman must be involved in the fundraiser. The museum sponsors a number of creative endeavors. One of them is dance. And this coming Saturday, they plan to hold a fundraiser here with the participation of the touring troupe of the National Ballet of Cuba. There are different categories of donors, and my donation ensures that the good doctor and his wife, the mysterious lady of the sea, will be obliged to invite me to this evening. There was still a day left until the event, and to be honest, I didn't want to risk running into Becky. So I got into the Beamer and drove 45 minutes across the island to the north side. The concierge told me about a place called Alcudia. It is just a few miles east of Pollença, the main town on the northeast coast. Alcudia is an entire preserved Roman city, just like the more famous Pompeii in Italy. On the side of the road stands the Forum, houses and theater as the Romans left them. Most of the buildings have thigh-high walls, just like Pompeii, but walking around this place feels like traveling back in time. I wandered around the city for a while, just touching the ghosts. Then I sat down on a 2,000-year-old stone bench and thought about the true purpose of my trip. I wanted to go as far outside of myself as possible to appreciate what I had planned, and the farthest place I could think of was ancient Rome. Honestly, I wasn't sure if I would have divorced Becky after the Osborne incident. I truly believed that she had made a one-time mistake. She was a smart woman and most likely would not do that again. But the damage done to my psyche, and yes, my ego, was likely irreparable. I loved her and still wanted her. But in my mind, the events of that fateful Christmas party were like a cancer slowly eating away at our marriage. So divorce seemed the only logical step, and I think we both understood that. Of course, when I learned that she had died, all the emotional baggage associated with her actions that fateful night was buried under a tsunami of grief and loss. The terrible news completely washed away all traces of infidelity and replaced them with a feeling of regret. I loved her when she was alive and felt that I should be more merciful and understanding towards her now that she was dead. Then, like the ghost of Christmas past, she appeared again, a completely different person due to her amnesia, and married to another man. Oddly enough, it didn't seem strange to me that I met her on this island. I specifically came to the Balearics to visit the place where her plane crashed, and, undoubtedly, Mallorca was the place where they would take someone if they found him alive. Now, I was literally dealing with a new version of my wife. Honestly, I realized that if I made any attempt to wake her up, it would lead to a serious breakdown for both of us. It was a risk because a lot has changed. So, given all this moral turmoil, what's the right thing to do? I just didn't know. Perhaps the best outcome would be that Becky would not regain any of her memories of me. I could start a new life with the confidence that fate had decreed it this way. But what should I do if she does remember me? How to establish a relationship with a person who is everything to you, and at the same time, a complete stranger? My main concern was, am I doing the right thing? I knew Bastet's answer. She would say that I should be true to myself and my nature, because honor lies in being who you are. If that's the case, then I should at least make an honest attempt to get my wife back. To come to the celebration, I hired a limousine. I could drive my BMW M8. This is an amazing car, but I wanted to be flexible, taking into account all the possible outcomes of our meeting. The museum itself is located on the traditional street of Palma, that is, narrow and elegant. I stepped out of the limousine and through the beautiful wrought iron Spanish gates at the entrance into the cool, bustling world of wealth and power. I was wearing a $7,000 Armani silk tuxedo that the hotel had made for me overnight, and I looked the part. Despite this, I was nervous. I was probably richer than everyone else here combined. However, Just 3 years ago, I was an Army nerd from mid-Michigan, intimidated by the glitz and glamour. A gorgeous young Spanish woman in a tight little black dress stood at the tastefully tailored reception desk. I walked up to her, and she greeted me with a 4,000 megawatt smile. She saw that I was American and probably a donor, so she said, "How can I help you, senor?" I presented my documents. She tapped a little on the keys of the registration laptop, and her eyes widened. She said embarrassedly, "Of course, senor. Let me take you to the owners. Okay, maybe I went a little overboard with the donation, but it was the most important event in my life." I followed the girl through several rooms, which obviously contained high-end art. I work in software, so I don't know anything about artists. But from the pretentious conversation, I realized that I was among Miros, Picasso, and Dali. Oh my God! The owners themselves waited in the area where food was served. When I walked in, I saw my wife as Osborne must have seen her, sensually slender and sexy. She was wearing a red dress, different from the one she was wearing the last time I saw her, 3 long years ago. The dress highlighted Besa's stunning look: raven black hair, sparkling blue eyes, alabaster skin with red lipstick and nails. She had a perfectly proportioned body, hips, waist, and breasts. It was educational. Honestly, how can you resist something like that? But this time she looked relaxed, graceful, effortless, and truly sophisticated. This was not the nerdy girl I knew and loved. March Bretman was wearing a tuxedo. He looked disdainfully domineering and at the same time exhausted. He was much shorter than me, like most people, with a head full of snow-white hair and an impeccable Van Dyke-style beard. He and Becky were not at all suitable for each other. I saw that they loved each other and were comfortable in their relationship, but in reality they were more like father and daughter than husband and wife. I was aware of the fact that Becky had turned into a completely different person when she went dark, and I had the funny thought that sooner or later she would probably kill the doctor with sex, which, of course, caused an amazing attack of pure, undisguised jealousy. I realized that I had no right to feel this way, because in all moral and legal senses, the woman I met was Bretman's wife, not mine. My little voice whispered in warning, "All this, error." My young lady guide approached them as if they were royalty and said something in Spanish. Both turned and looked inquisitively in my direction. They must have known about the shocking amount of money I had just added to the museum's operating budget. Only Becky separated and headed towards me, accompanied by the little hostess of the evening, leaving her husband standing alone. She smiled welcomingly, and I almost fainted from the unreality of it all. It's one thing to plan, but as Clausewitz said, no plan survives its first encounter with the enemy. Becky approached me serenely, with the grace and radiant confidence of a lady from the estate. She extended her hand in a noble greeting. I took her into mine, and the whole universe changed. Humans are electrical creatures. Our nerves transmit signals in turn from cell to cell, which in concept is no different from a network. And we've just completed the circuit. I felt a connection. She too. Beca's face changed from calm to puzzled. She said in a strong Spanish accent, "Welcome, I'm Maria March Bretman. My husband doesn't speak English fluently, so he asked me to greet you." Confusion was written on her face. I thought in shock, "Maria?" Then it dawned on me, that's right, she doesn't remember who she is. So, of course, she was given a new name. In a Catholic country, what could be more fitting for the mystic Lady of the Sea than Mary? I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Happy to be here, madam." I demonstrated this happiness by depositing 50 grand into their treasury. Perhaps I could have gotten an invitation for less money, but he didn't want anyone to interrupt him. Additionally, this is just the accrued interest for any given to a stay. Money makes money, and I couldn't spend it all in a dozen lifetimes. I added, "My name is Eric, and I am honored to meet 2 such outstanding philanthropists." When I said my name, Maria began to look even more confused and upset. However, she recovered gracefully and said, "Let me introduce you to my husband. He is a sponsor of this event and would like to thank you for your donation. I will translate for him. I could barely stand, because the fact is that I was her husband, and everything was starting to seem like a very bad idea. She turned and I followed her. Oh my God! The dress was backless, right down to her second two adorable dimples. Becky would never wear something like that. The smooth, muscular, alabaster vision before me nearly gave me a heart attack. It's a miracle that my hand didn't shake when I shook Bretman's hand. He said something in Spanish. Maria translated, "My husband thanks you for your donation and would like to know who you are and what you do." The guy was just polite. However, he took me through the looking glass much earlier than I had planned. Well, I took up the tug. "Don't say it's not hefty," I said, speaking slowly so that Maria could translate. I worked for the U.S. government in a place called Fort Meade in Maryland. Maria gave me a shocked look and then looked away with growing concern. Fort Meade definitely brought back memories, of course. She spent her entire professional life there. I added, "I was happily married to a woman named Rebecca, whom I loved immensely, but she lost it in a plane crash, and her death almost killed me too. It was already close to the line. But if I wanted to resurrect old memories, I had to tell her like it was." Maria translated again, looking more and more puzzled. Her husband listened politely, the way you would if some boring nerd who had just handed you $50,000 in cash was telling his life story. I added because I was moving into territory that Becky knew nothing about. I was so devastated by her loss that I resigned from the army and went public with my little invention. It brought in an incredible amount of money. Then he laughed and said smugly, "Well, you know how technology creates billionaires overnight. Bretman couldn't have known this because even Americans don't understand the implausible world of technology markets." So I added, "And since then I've been wandering around the world, trying to come to terms with the loss of my wife, whom I called Becky." And finished sadly, "It is very difficult." At this point, I stopped and looked at Maria for her to translate. But she stood silently with a worried expression on her face. Then she stammered, "Sorry," and ran away in the direction of the registration desk. A few minutes later, that little Spanish beauty appeared and said, "Mrs. March Bretman is not feeling well, so she asked me to translate for you." She was puzzled by Maria's rapid departure, as was the good doctor. I wasn't. I told Bretman, "Will everything be okay with your wife?" I actually wasn't interested in Becky Maria's health. I wanted to know the diagnosis. The girl translated my question. Bretman said something in response to her for a long time, and then turned and left. It was clear that he was embarrassed to deal with me without having his wife as a buffer, and so they got rid of me. I didn't object because I now considered it an unimportant detail. The Spanish woman beckoned to me, and then turned and walked towards the luxurious bar. I followed her, admiring the sway of her beautiful round hips. She was about 5'7" and perfectly proportioned, if you like curvy women. Imagine a 23-year-old version of Salma Hayek. She said something to the people behind the counter, and they immediately brought out an elegant jug of cool sangria. This was exactly the drink that was suitable for this occasion. She took 2 large round glasses of fruit and walked to the table. The place began to fill with guests, and I noticed Bretman at the other end of the hall, entertaining, as it seemed to me, a whole flock of grandees. This was Becca's world now. I saw that I did not belong to him. I sat down at the table when the girl poured us a couple of rather large glasses of wine and said, "My name is Sophia, and Dr. Bretman has asked me to be your hostess for the rest of the evening." The dark, luminous eyes on her gorgeous face suggested that there was more to this statement than a simple desire to be hospitable. "Did he tell you what happened to Mrs. March Bretman?" "It looks like the problem is much more serious than a simple headache or upset stomach." Sophia replied, "You must have heard that Dr. Bretman's wife is in a very strange situation." I said rather impatiently, "Yes, she was found adrift at sea with no memory of her past. Dr. Bretman is the man who treated her, and they eventually became lovers and got married." I heard this story almost as soon as I landed here. She added with doubt in her voice. Dr. Bretman just explained that recently his wife has begun to recover parts of her past. 3 years is the normal point in the development of amnesia when the patient begins to remember what they have lost, and when this happens, it can be very upsetting for the patient. I nodded in agreement and said, Understand, the patient should feel as if she is waking up from a dream, where it is difficult to tell exactly where the dream ends and reality begins. Sophia added, Apparently, you said something that made Mrs. Bretman remember part of her past, which is why she left so abruptly. The doctor thinks it's probably because you're an American and she was from that country. I thought, or maybe it's because I basically just trampled on Rebecca Spencer's grave by telling Maria March Bretman who she really is. Sophia continued, So, the doctor asked me to ask you to please leave. He means no disrespect and is grateful for your donation, but he loves his wife, and it's obvious that your presence here upsets her. Seriously? Rebecca, or Becky, or Maria, or whatever her name was no more upset than I was. I planned to throw a few breadcrumbs to see if I couldn't get her back to her old life. But now that I had let the genie out of the bottle, I had the overwhelming feeling that I had gone too far. Worse, as far-fetched as it may sound, I also wondered if the good doctor had gotten the hint that I was more than I looked. He was not an idiot, and it was clear to any observer that my presence had a radical emotional effect on his wife. Sophia continued in her sultry voice, He asked me to accompany you if you want, and he will pay for whatever the two of us do tonight. Yeah, bribe. What's wrong with me taking this stunning young girl to my home for a sweaty night of passion? She was probably the sexiest 23-year-old on the island, and I was sure that judging by the ample cleavage on display in her little short black dress, she would be amazing in bed. She looked at me with hunger and anticipation, waiting for the obvious answer. The only problem was that I still have a wife, and I just don't think it's right, no matter how crazy it sounds. As I said before, nerds mate for life, and I didn't want to complicate an already difficult situation further. I said, hating myself for sounding like a sentimental fool. You are an incredibly attractive girl, Sophia, but I've already caused enough trouble this evening, so now I'll just go back to the hotel alone. Her face fell. I'm a good guy, and with my money, Quasimodo would look attractive. I added with regret in my voice, I probably shouldn't have come here in the first place. Tell the doctor. I'm sorry I upset his wife, and no hard feelings. I stood up, and Sophia walked me back to the courtyard exit. I kicked myself as I stood there in the soft Palma night. She was a beautiful and sensual young woman. But I needed to get away from there to think. Nerds think too much. This is our curse. I sincerely said, I'll feel better in the morning. Give me your number. Maybe I'll call you. This cheered her up. I handed her my phone, and she entered the number into it, saying, with a lot of promises in her voice, Call me, senor. You will not regret it. And I went outside. I probably looked out of place walking around in a silk tuxedo amid the hustle and bustle of Carrer Saint-Michel. It was lunchtime, so the streets were crowded with the noise and smell of those ubiquitous little motorized scooters that locals ride like they want to kill themselves and you. They moved through the leisurely herd of tourists like border collies herding sheep. I walked slowly in the beauty of the evening palm, dealing with strong conflicting emotions. I couldn't go back to what it was like after meeting Becky and talking to her. But what could I do in this situation? The only thing I knew for sure was that I had to do something. The large crowd was excited as they passed through the arch leading to the Plaza Mayor. Plaza Mayor is the central place in this part of Mallorca. This is a huge space where open-air markets are held. That evening there was some kind of spectacular fireworks show. Everyone stopped to watch. I stood a few meters from the plaza with my hands in my pockets and looked up as rockets streaked overhead and burst into starlight, which provided the perfect backdrop for a quiet voice behind me to say, Hello, Eric. I knew this could happen, but it still shook me to the core. She followed me. I turned around and she was standing there in her gorgeous red dress with tears in her eyes, looking both scared and hopeful. Her stunning beauty was like a physical blow to the chest. This set me back a step. I said in a trembling voice, "Rebecca!" She nodded readily. It was the same quick nod she gave when I first learned she was Tiffin Ilarion. Then she ran into my arms and we kissed like long-lost lovers, which we probably were. The crowd around us thought I proposed or something. Everyone was clapping and cheering us on, and we kept clinging to each other as if we ever let each other go, we'd bring the whole world down. You could almost hear the romantic music playing in the background. At that moment, the romantic interlude was interrupted by 5 men in formal uniforms. A gloomy, elderly man, clearly their leader, approached us and said authoritatively, "Come with me, Madame Bretman, and we will take you back to your husband." The tone of voice sounded like someone talking to a mentally ill person. She looked at him and said firmly, "My last name is not Bretman, and I am not a doctor's wife." She turned, pointed at me, and said, "I am his wife." This small gesture meant the world to me. Rebecca made her choice without hesitation. The leader said patronizingly, "Of course, madam, but we still have to return you to your husband. He is very worried about you." It suddenly dawned on me that the entire conversation was conducted in English. It was for my sake. He turned to his 2 henchmen and said, "Please escort Mrs. Bretman back to the museum." Each man carefully took one of Becca's hands and led her away. She continued to protest gently. This was the Becky I knew. She would rather die than arrange a sandal. The gentleman doing all the talking turned to me and said, "I have instructions to put you on a boat and see to it that you leave this harbor. If you do not do this, you will be arrested for attempting to kidnap Mrs. Bretman." I realized that Bretman was not as ignorant as I thought. He guessed that I was Becca's real husband and wanted me to disappear. Then he could return to the pleasant pastime of psychologically manipulating my wife. The clumsy attempt to sweep me under the rug completely negated any moral obligations I might have towards our common spouse. The authorities are on his side, and there was no way I could win in the current situation. But, as I mentioned, I have certain skills, and Bretman just bought himself a one-way ticket to his doom. It's time to play dirty. My boat was in the same direction as the hotel. However, instead of taking the Carrer dels Apuntadors to Plaza de la Reine, we took Avenue d'Antoni Maura, which led directly to the marina. I was passive throughout the entire walk, because they essentially threw me back into the thorn bush. I needed to get to my hacking gear before I could do some really bad things to each and every bad guy, and that was on a yacht. But my luggage and Bastet were still in the hotel. I protested, "You should let me go back to the hotel to get my clothes and the cat." The man said with slight sarcasm, "This has already been taken care of, sir. My people don't appreciate your cat unless it really is a cat and not a miniature leopard. 2 of them are now with the doctors. They are treating their wounds." Obviously, Bastet did not go easy. He added warningly, "If you return, you will be arrested on serious charges." When his men dropped me off, I, without saying a word, climbed into the closed central cabin of the Hellas and started the Yanmar diesel. I switched the engine and slowly sailed out of the parking lot, turned on the running lights and headed southwest towards the distant lighthouse of Cala Figuera and apparently out of their lives. As soon as I cleared the breakwater and entered the Bay of Palma, I turned off my running lights and silently sailed towards Isla de la Caleta, near the Playa de Ilete area, southeast of Palma. The entire time I was doing this, Bastet was complaining loudly from below deck. As soon as I was firmly on the 2 anchors, I opened the gangway hatch, and she rushed past me as if she wanted to continue the fight. I laughed and said, "They're all gone." Bastet stared at me with the primal rage of her kind blazing in her huge green eyes and said indignantly, "They put me in a cage. It's good that you killed them all, brother. It saved me a lot of hassle." Cats never stray far from the jungle. After all the emotional turmoil of the evening, it was still only 10:30. I poured myself a couple glasses of Johnny Walker Blue to relax, lit a Cohiba Cuban cigar, and sat on the deck with my cat. Bastet was still fantasizing about ripping out her guts. I watched the lights come on in the hotels behind Playa de Ilete. I had a long night ahead of me, and wanted to take the time to think of the perfect plan. It was obvious that my wife had regained her memory, and I needed to get her to the yacht and away from this place before her current husband had a chance to reprogram her. I began to suspect that her memory was beginning to return in the usual way, but the person she trusted most, her doctor and husband, kept her on a short mental leash. I was going to rip off this leash and make everyone pay for it. I had on board a system unit with a 32-core AMD Ryzen Threadripper 3970X processor. Its computing power would be enough to make a black hole jealous. So speed and time were not important concepts to me. I also had a 100 megabit connection, allowing me to work from anywhere in the world, including Palma Bay. In the real world, I may be a tall, skinny nerd, but in the virtual world, I'm a blonde paladin. The time has come to save the beautiful maiden. Bretman and his friends won't even know what hit them. Palma authorities awoke to a flashing warning that read, "Critical weather warning." The link was an official Spanish government URL. Most people clicked on it, which resulted in a 404 error message. This was such a common occurrence that no one thought about it until all their systems went externally managed. Bretman received several types of messages, including invitations to watch TikTok videos on various known interests of his, offers to sell a number of expensive items he liked, and an ominous request from his bank marked private and confidential. He bought the latter. Now I owned this man's entire life. Hackers rely on people to click on links. Meanwhile, I spent most of the night driving around Palencia on the other side of the island. With a little light internet research, I found the Bretman Mansion. This was the place where Becky was treated for her delusions about having another husband, not far from Carrer de Formentor, about 200 meters from where I moored my Zodiac. I was dressed like an ordinary tourist, relaxing quite innocently with my cat and backpack, leaning against the high cement wall of the Bretman complex. To complete my plans, I needed to be closer to home. I knew Becky was there, but he had no idea where exactly she was or how many people were looking after her. Wi-Fi Pineapple is a popular penetration testing gadget because it is the evil twin that allows network theft. However, it has a limited range. Therefore, I had to be in close proximity to the router. Such closeness can be created using a network repeater, and I just had one that fit perfectly on the cat's collar. Bastet is not the most accommodating animal, but if she thinks it's about hunting, she can be persuaded to do anything. Bastet hissed as I threw her over the wall. "When should I bring the loot, brother?" I said. "Just scout out this place for us, and come back as soon as you can." It took no more than a minute for the repeater on Bastet's collar to ping Bretman's router and establish communication with my pineapple. I pressed the button, dropping the repeater from the collar into the grass. I didn't want Bastet to take it out of range. Then I used my iPad to change Pineapple's SSID to the SSID of the router in my house. Now, the evil twin was running the show, and I had access to all the digital equipment in Bretman's house. I waited a couple of minutes, and Bastet flew over the wall again. Naturally, something was twitching in her mouth. I said impatiently, "Drop it!" She growled, "Wait," and disappeared into the bushes. A minute later, she came out looking pleased and followed me around the perimeter of the complex until we reached the gate. They were controlled by the system I had just taken over. I was sure that Becky was in the house. Her phone was pinging all night, and the small dot was blinking regularly in the same place. However, I needed to know exactly where exactly it was. The security cameras in the house were state-of-the-art. Becky was reading in her luxurious bedroom. She was wearing skinny jeans and a simple peasant blouse that emphasized the perfect oval of her face. She looked like she was being sedated. There were several servants in the house, all women, and one thug guard sipping coffee in the kitchen. I needed to distract the guard. I'm a pretty big guy myself and quite strong, but nerds aren't instinctive fighters. They prefer tricks. With the guard out of the way, I planned to run about 100 meters to the French doors that opened from Becca's bedroom into the expansive ornamental garden. From there, I had to return to the Zodiac and go out into the Mediterranean Sea. I programmed an attack on the function buttons. The first was to set off the alarm in the garage behind the mansion. It was several hundred meters up the hill. As soon as the guard responds to the alarm, the second will unlock the gate and the third will unlock Bexa's room. I saw from the system that all of its doors were protected by digital locks. Bretman literally kept his wife under lock and key. This meant that Becky had told him that she was my wife, and in my mind, this dishonorable act of his justified everything I was about to do. Even if I didn't know that the good doctor was sleeping with my hot girlfriend Sophia on the side, the moment of truth has come. I told Bastet, "Stay here," and pressed button number 1. In the distance, a siren howled ominously. I saw the guard jump to his feet and run out the door, followed by most of the staff. Then he pressed buttons 2 and 3. The gates unlocked and began to swing open. I rushed across the lawn. Bastet was running silently next to me. "Cats!" Her impatient look said, "Who are we attacking, brother?" I walked up to the French doors to Beka's room. My wife heard the warning siren and stood in the doorway, looking outside worriedly. As soon as she noticed me, an expression of adoration appeared on her beautiful face, and I hesitated, shocked by the depth of my feelings for her. Bastet hissed, "Faster, brother!" I reached out, turned the handle, and opened the door. Becky looked surprised. She obviously knew she was imprisoned and wondered why the door opened so easily. I grabbed her hand and said, "Hurry up," and we began to walk back down the sloping lawn to the gate. As soon as we were outside the walls, Becky said, "Wait." She turned and did something intricate with the gate keypad. The gate slowly closed. I didn't know what spell she was using, but my wife is a real magician. She said, "I blocked them. It will take forever to get out of the complex." Anyone watching from the outside would have seen the tall botanist and his beautiful wife casually strolling hand in hand towards the water. Oddly enough, they were accompanied by a large gray-spotted cat, walking next to them like a house dog. The three of them climbed into the Zodiac and sailed away to a big blue sailboat and a new life together. The authorities of Palma agreed to forget about the existence of Becky and me, that is, if I unlocked their computers. It's amazing how governments around the world have become so dependent on their information systems and how much leverage can be gained by accidentally owning them. Isn't ransom fun? As for Bretman, I could prove that he was a randy old goat. I had messages and emails documenting his inappropriate affair with his assistant Sophia Montes. And in the case of my wife, it turned out that the good doctor kept Becky in strict psychotropic bonds the entire time they were married. In my opinion, this was exactly the same side of criminal rape. I had enough information on this man from the data dump I scraped from his computer to ruin his life, and I sent him an anonymous message through the Tor browser to make him aware of this fact. And yet, it turned out that the loss of his wife was punishment enough. Becky was the only thing he truly treasured. However, since I felt the same way about her, I was in no mood to share it. Becky fell asleep as soon as we got on board. The Hylas had an exceptionally luxurious cabin with a real bunk, and she staggered across the deck and down the companionway. As she disappeared, she muttered, "I need to sleep. He gave me something. I don't know what it is, but I need to sleep. I have added one more charge to Bretman's account. I say it with the relief one might feel when one has just gotten one's life back. Stay there as long as necessary. We have a lot of conversations to do, and you need to be rested and clear-headed to do it. Much more could be said, but that will be later, when the nightmare passes. I knew we needed space and time to deal with the radical changes in our lives. There were several places we could go, but there were also limitations. The first was that we could not go to the nearest shore, Spain. I have enough problems in this country. So it will be France. I may have been richer than Croesus, but the situation was relatively new to me, and my previous experience had not extended beyond Michigan, Pittsburgh, Fort Benning, and the Beltway. So I did what any ignorant botanist would do. I went to the only place I had ever heard of and which I knew for sure was in the south of France, Monaco. The satellite navigation showed that it was just over 400 miles away and about 2 days' journey. I set the autopilot to magnetic heading, 047 north-northeast and raised the sails to a steady 8 knots. A strong westerly wind was still blowing, and we were on starboard tack. It was a beautiful day for swimming. The Hylas is a wet boat, in the sense that it is designed to cut through the waves rather than crash against them. This design provides a smoother ride, but at the same time a lot of water gets through the side. Therefore, the cockpit, located immediately behind the mast, is sealed. I was sitting at the helm, admiring the late evening sunset, when my wife appeared with Bastet. Becky left her previous life with nothing but clothes on her, but she got hold of one of my hoodies. Since there is almost a 30-centimeter difference between her height and mine, she maintained her modesty. Bastet curled around Becca's legs, as cats do, expressing love, which was surprising, since I did not even suspect that Bastet loved anyone other than herself. Becky drank 2 glasses of the premium Beaujolais that I keep below deck as ballast. This is my version, and I stand by it. She looked sleepy, handed me 1 bottle, and said, "I slept for 13 hours, and I'm going to continue. But I would like to sit here for a minute to reassure myself that it is really you, and that everything is really happening." She sat down on the bench next to the pilot's seat, tucked her long, slender legs under her, and sipped her wine, looking at me as if she still thought I was a dream. Bastet sat next to her, like a kind little cat, and poked her head, which is what cats do when they mark with a smell what they consider theirs. What did my magician wife do to my formerly ferocious cat? Becca's thick raven hair was tousled, and her huge blue eyes sparkled with sleep. She looked magnificent in the soft fading light of the Mediterranean sunset. Her perfectly proportioned features with incredibly sensual lips and long, graceful neck sticking out of my old army sweatshirt looked relaxed. She said, "It's true, isn't it? Do you still love me?" This was not as unusual as it might seem. Seriously, I was considering divorcing her when her plane crashed, and she has been living with Dr. Coble as husband and wife for the last few years. This can be a deciding factor on several levels if you're a fairly insecure brat, but I just didn't feel it and said, "Of course I love you," and he never stopped loving, no matter the situation. However, the circumstances that will unfold next are complex, and we need to take as much time as necessary to understand them. I added, without mincing words, "I'm heading to Monaco." Here I stopped to admit my confusion. "This is the only place in the south of France that I have ever heard of. We can renew our marriage by going there. Now go back to bed, and Bastet and I will take care of the boat." Becky stood up, and Bastet lightly jumped down to the deck and followed her. I muttered under my breath, "Traitor!" My wife had always been like St. Francis of Assisi when it came to animals, and this was further proof of how little she had changed. When sailing alone, you learn to doze wisely. The course is monitored by an autopilot, but it would be foolish to leave the helm unattended because there are many shipping lanes here. I saw several container ships and other large vessels at various times of the day, but the ocean is huge, and they were just distant points of light. A truly touching sight was the incredible canvas of black velvet sky with billions of brightly shining diamonds scattered across it. This vision calmed me, as always. If you spend any time in the Mediterranean, you will understand why most Western religions originated in this region. Soon after sunrise, the coast of Francia appeared. We were far out to sea, but on the distant horizon we could already feel land, and seabirds circled above us, greeting us. Becky looked much more cheerful and had a large mug of black coffee. This time she was wearing only my fisherman's sweater, with her gorgeous legs sticking out from underneath. It made her look like a model from an erotic Ralph Lauren ad. I had been awake for almost 48 hours, with little sleep in between, and I began to hallucinate. So I said, "Stay clear of the keels of all passing cruise ships while I grab 3 hours." Becky nodded and took the helm, her new shadow laying adoringly at her feet. I wasn't worried about leaving Becky in charge. She was a better helmsman than I was when we sailed on the island packet. Was it really just 3 eternal years ago? we have something to discuss. Port Hercules has been a deep-water harbor for ships sailing along the Côte d'Azur since the time of the Phoenicians. It was they who founded the Monoikos colony. The Phoenicians came from the Greek part of the Mediterranean, and their hero was Hercules, hence the name of the port. Of course, I didn't know any of this, since I'm a programmer, not a historian. But from where we moored at the Jetty Luciana, I could see the nearby Monte Carlo Casino. The casino was the reason I knew we were in Monaco. Maybe later I can watch James Bond play with Le Chiffre in Chemin de Fer. The yacht Hylas, only 13.5 meters long and worth $1 million, was squeezed into the breakwater's outer dock, along with the rest of the rabble. In this ancient port, only the super yachts of the oligarchs received good berths. Becky let me sleep for a full 5 hours before she woke me up. Now we sat side by side on the velvet benches at the stern, drinking delicious Kona roast coffee and looking in amazement at the city waking up around us. My beautiful wife led 2 separate, very private lives, first as a happy nerd from Beltway, and then as a closed aristocrat on a small island, and therefore was no more sophisticated than I was. She was dressed in jeans and a peasant blouse, which she had worn when we fled Majorca. So, the first thing was to dress her as befits the wife of a fabulously rich eccentric. All the luxury shops in Monaco are concentrated around Place de la Casino, located a 15-minute walk from the marina. So we walked hand in hand to the Golden Circle. Balenciaga, Prada, Gucci, Saint Laurent, and Dior were there, but Becky headed straight to Zara, a Spanish and relatively inexpensive store. Apparently, 3 years spent as a Spanish flu took their toll. $28,000 later, our things were delivered, and we stopped for lunch at Le Grill on the 8th floor of the Hôtel de Paris. From here, we had a panoramic view of the city below us, vibrant and sunlit. He was an inspiration, especially to a couple of unsophisticated nerds from Sodom and Gomorrah on the Potomac. Of course, this elephant still stood between us, and sooner or later we would have to fight it. Up to this point, we were just trying to survive, and survival seems to narrow your horizons to really important things. Now that we're back in that comfortable rut that all married people fall into, it's time to open a can of worms. The first difference I noticed about Becky 2.0 was that she was no longer shy. This version was wearing one of her new acquisitions, old items that had been thrown into the trash bin at Zara. It was a simple long-sleeve red top over a tight, black outfit that showed off her gorgeous hips, butt, and legs like they were painted on. Guys all over the restaurant were secretly craning their necks. We sat in the bright sun, poking around our soufflé traditional, waiting for another to open the auction. Finally, Becky said, puzzled, "How did you become so rich?" The question was reasonable, since the last time she saw me I was living on the captain's salary. I answered, trying to speak to the point. "Do you remember that gadget I worked on all these Saturdays? So at your funeral, I got to talking with your father." "Up!" That was probably the stupidest thing I could ever say. I managed to roll both my own and her parents' deep grief into a monumental ball of guilt. She recoiled as if I had slapped her, and then sat for a minute and looked out the window. Finally, she turned to me and said with tears in her eyes, "It must have been terrible for you. There are times in life when you need to think carefully about what you're going to say." She probably expected to be offended. After all, we both knew what prompted it. But her death put everything in its place, and her subsequent life as a different person erased any feeling that the woman sitting at the table opposite me was the old Becky. I needed to tread carefully. It was someone else, and I grew up a little. Grief tends to do that to you. I said, "Of course it was terrible, I loved you. Everyone loved it. It made us remember a lot of good things, and in the end, it helped us cope with our grief. No one ever dies as long as he is remembered fondly by someone living. I had nothing but loving memories, and that's why, in my universe, you were still alive." Now she was actually tearing up. She impulsively reached out, took my hand in both of her little paws, brought it to her lips, and kissed it, saying, "What hurts me most is that for 3 years I had absolutely no memory of you or our life together." She added sincerely, "Recently I started having disturbing dreams. I didn't understand why I felt this way. After all, for the most part, I was coping with my life in a new and very strange country. And then you appeared in front of me, and it was as if I woke up after a long sleep. I saw that she could barely stand on her feet, so I paid the check, and we hurried back to the boat. I brewed some oolong tea for us, and we sat on the large leather sofa, facing each other, but not touching. This was the final point. Her huge blue eyes were clouded with emotion, and her beautiful, elastic body almost vibrated like a guitar string. I started by saying, "Listen, I know that you remember the reason why all this happened." She looked worried and said, "I recovered most of my memories, but the details of the period leading up to my awakening in the hospital in Palma are hazy," and hesitantly added, "It's like a scene in a movie when you see enough fragments of a cataclysm to understand that you are there. But you don't remember a single detail. I clearly remember how I came to my senses in a crashed plane and moved from its wing to the raft. It was in the dark and in the pouring rain." She added bitterly, "But I don't know how I got there. I remember the sun, the thirst, the pain in my head, and how scared I was. I also remember the panic I felt when I first realized that I didn't remember who I was. But that's all." I said, "What is the last thing you remember clearly?" She thought for a second and said, "The last coherent memory of our life together was you and me the week after Thanksgiving, with my parents in New York. We were so happy then." So Becky had no memory of the period between then and her awakening in early January in Mallorca, with a completely blank slate. It made medical sense. I knew from what I had read that memory loss of the period before a traumatic brain injury was common. Whether this is because the brain cells are actually destroyed or the event was so severe that the subconscious mind decided to bury it is still a matter of medical speculation. Recent traumatic brain injuries sustained in Iraq have prompted more careful study of this issue. Thus, Becca's memory of the 3 weeks leading up to and following the disaster, including her struggle to survive, was undoubtedly lost forever. Considering that the events that followed, her disappearance and reappearance in the first place, were orders of magnitude more significant than the mess with Osborne, it seemed childish to even bring up the subject now. I said incredulously, "Are you saying that you don't know why you ended up in Mallorca in the first place?" She said, still looking worried, "Yes. Can't you tell me?" And I told you. I did this impartially and without editing. Now I was an incredibly rich bore, and she was the ex-wife of a Spanish nobleman. So, in my opinion, it would be infantile to waste time on a one-time grievance related to someone else. I told her that we would most likely break up because of this, but now it doesn't matter anymore because we have become two different people, no matter how incredible it may seem. "Of coursey," she cried. It was such a sad situation. I assured her that I had extracted several painful pounds of flesh from her seducer, and she said that was not why she was crying. I hear you asking me, why was Becky so dismissive of her blunder with Osborne? Well, think about it. She just spent 3 years doing her duty as a woman with another man. And rightly so, this will most likely be a bigger problem than one drunken slip-up. She said, "I am humiliated by what I did that night. I will have to bear this stain for the rest of my life, and I will bear it with shame. I was a naive fool trying to deny my own sexuality. But now I know myself much better, and I also know that this will never happen again." Then she looked at me intently and said with a challenge in her voice, "It seems to me that everything I did that night pales in comparison to the fact that I lived with a man whom I loved so much that I married him. Heinrich was very demanding and more than a little perverted, and to make matters worse, I was enjoying it. My wife was completely honest, which is what an honest person should be at this stage. She said that the old Becky, the nerdy girl I knew and loved, was a thing of the past. Before me is a completely different woman, with a refined appetite for the carnal arts, thanks to a very dirty old man. I had a sad feeling that now it was I who was inexperienced. My wife was no longer ashamed of her passions. On the contrary, I used them to the maximum. She and her second husband were obviously doing something extraordinary, and she now appreciated the act of love like a connoisseur. It was something I either had to accept or just leave. I won't lie. This shocked me. I already realized that the stumbling block would be Becca's second marriage, with all the ensuing consequences, and I knew that this was the only thing I would have to come to terms with. That is, if we ever want to return to the intimate connection we once had. But that's my problem. Becky played no role in the decision-making process. However, no matter how insanely jealous I felt at the thought of my beautiful Becky giving herself to this lecherous old goat, I did not at all consider her actions to be infidelity in any sense of the word. Seriously, it would be completely childish to consider her actions as betrayal because she didn't even know about my existence. Even so, I am not Iron Man. So, I said with obvious irritation, could you be a little more specific with your words? She frowned and said quietly, you must understand that I woke up in conditions where I did not know who I was, why I was here, or even where this here was. I was terrified. Then, over the course of several months, Heinrich healed me and helped me adjust to the emptiness that was inside me. Naturally, I began to consider him my support and savior. I asked hesitantly, so you love him? She understood what I was asking and reacted angrily. God, no! What I felt for him is a drop in the ocean compared to what I feel, and have always felt, for you. I didn't know about your existence when I fell in love with Henry and married him. But still, for you to understand how much I have changed, you must admit that I spent 3 years as the wife of another man. Just like that, right out in the open. I truly appreciated Besa's honesty because it gave us a basis to move forward. I knew that the core of the problem was her, marriage. And I was already wondering in the dark of the night as we sailed here how I would react when she said it out loud. Now it's time to face the facts. Our reunion wasn't like running into an ex at the supermarket. Becky left my life in the worst possible way. Betrayal. Then she entered her again as another man's mistress. There was no way to untangle this knot. It was too fraught with painful complications. So the obvious answer was to cut it down. Two people who were once soulmates must build brand new memories from that day on, as if they had just met. This was the only solution that would take into account all the outrageous circumstances. For 3 years, I believed Becky was dead, and all that time she didn't even know I existed. During this time, a completely implausible series of events made me fabulously rich, with all the ensuing changes in worldview and lifestyle, and Becky was now a sophisticated woman with clearly defined and very refined erotic tastes. So, in truth, we were indeed complete strangers who, by coincidence, shared an inherited set of magical feelings. None of us were as innocent as before, but we had endless days ahead of us to establish a new normal. Maybe we could develop this? This may be easy, or it may not be possible. Everything depends on our ability to start over, based only on the individuals we have become. Becky was very smart. So I knew she would understand what I was talking about when I looked deep into her beautiful eyes, extended my hand and said, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Eric. We are complete strangers now, but I think that we can build a life together. All we need is to base it on an old love. Do you want to accompany me on this journey? She gave me the same quick affirmative nod she gave me when we first met, both times before, and simply said, forever. My wife was an absolute terror that night, wilder than I remembered her. This was truly our first night alone, at least when we weren't evading the Majorcan authorities or on the ocean. So I wanted to make it unforgettable. I made a reservation at La Montgolfière Henri Gerasi restaurant. It was the closest Michelin-starred restaurant, and money can buy anything. Because of her flamboyance, Becky has always favored bright colors. At least in this respect, she has not changed. So, she was wearing a sparkly emerald Balenciaga dress that we picked out that morning. It showed off the cleavage of her graceful breasts and her gorgeous, slender figure. Looking across the table at Becky, I felt a deep discrepancy between the graceful and sophisticated woman I was dining with and my favorite nerd. My new wife was a striking socialite who fit seamlessly into the luxurious surroundings. I'm much smaller. But I studied. The waiters, being French, made a lot of fuss during our meal. But Becky did not take her ardent gaze off me. She seemed to still be convincing herself that she wasn't dreaming. During dinner, we talked about our future, and I felt the past retreating to where it rightfully belongs. We took a taxi back to the pier, wrapped in a cocoon of cozy intimacy. And then my wife did an amazing thing. She just took a stylish step off the dock onto the deck of the Hellas, wearing 10-centimeter heeled Manolo Blahniks. It's hard to make that transition from moccasins. What's even more incredible is that I've never seen her wear anything other than 5-centimeter heels before. As soon as she stepped onto the deck, she gave me a cat-like smile, unbuttoned her dress, and threw it at her feet, right there, in front of God and everyone in the harbor. I knew it was close to midnight, but still. She stood in the Venus de Milo pose, wearing nothing but sexy black lingerie and taupe elastic stockings. She stood in this position for a second. Then she gave me a satisfied look, got out of her dress lying in a heap, came up, grabbed me by the BVL Gari tie, and dragged me along the ramp. Watching those beautiful tight buns twitch in the thong while I followed was very intense, if you catch my drift. Of course, the fact that Becky was wearing a thong was another reminder that the new version had a few extra features. As soon as we got downstairs, she turned aggressively and knelt down, still giving me a sly smile. She pulled my pants off and got to work. Becky 1.0 has never done anything like this in our entire marriage. This new incarnation of my wife, under the guidance of the good doctor, has clearly learned a lot of new things. Predictably, I was overcome by an explosion of pure jealousy, but I could also tell that this version of Becca was trying to tell me something with this. She was a new and improved model, and I better just sit back and enjoy the ride. When we got to the bed, Becky wrapped both arms around my neck, placed her right hand behind my head, and pulled me into a heated kiss. Her wide, sensual mouth opened under mine, and I felt her tongue penetrate inside. She moaned loudly from these sensations. I wrapped my arms around her and pressed her to my chest. Her beautiful breasts were between us. She was breathing quickly, overwhelmed by the sensations. Her moans became louder. She freed herself for a moment, unclasped her bra, and let it slide sensuously from her shoulders. It was a show designed to stimulate me. The old Becky would never have done this. Becca's breasts are truly magnificent. I've seen them thousands of times before, but this is like watching the sun rise over the ocean, proof that God exists. She pushed me away and climbed onto the bed, positioning herself on top of me, and we had sex. When we finished, I looked in arrays. In those amazing blue eyes, I saw incredible strength, vitality, and irreplaceable wisdom, and then some. It was a simple statement that there was only room in her heart for one special man, and that man was me. It was a vision of her unwavering loyalty and absolute devotion. The lessons we learned in the process of rebirth have made us devoted life partners, and this newfound wisdom will guide our decisions. Chemistry is a funny thing. The attraction never goes away. Life has taught us both the price of choice. Some people just know it. Others have to learn things the hard way. But we both knew the rules now, and they were together forever. She said with deep feeling, "I love you, Eric. You will never have a reason to doubt me." It's a cliché that life is a journey of discovery. But again, platitudes exist precisely because they are true. It was the same with us. It took several bad decisions and unimaginable tragedy for us to understand each other. Now it will be a partnership, hers and mine. We will live our lives to the fullest, and Eric and Becky will fight together against the hellish minions of the Burning Legion, forever. Monterosso al Mare is the largest of the Cinque Terre ports. The Five Pearls are fishing villages on the Italian coast, located 60 miles south of Genoa. Like the other 4 picturesque towns, it is isolated by steep hills, where olives, grapes, and lemon trees have been grown since Roman times. This is an ideal place for people who want to get away from it all, to sit and talk. We sailed leisurely along the Mediterranean coast from France to Italy, stopping at every interesting place we came across. We dropped anchor and took the Zodiac to experience the history, food, and culture, often accompanied by a big spotted cat. Becky and Bastet became close to such an extent that this treacherous cat never left her side. Cats. Unlike my wife Rebecca, cats have absolutely no sense of loyalty. However, in many ways, my nightly talks with Bastet made me tougher and more pragmatic. At the same time, Becky and I developed a relationship that was perfect for a sailboat. There was no one else. It was just us and the ocean. It had been almost 6 months since we began our journey, and what we found was ourselves. Or at least new and improved versions of us. I guess you could call it growing up. We sat at a table outside the Enoteca da Eliseo restaurant in the old town of Monterosso, enjoying a superb example of local grapes. Becca's fabulous legs in Ralph Lauren, mulberry silk shorts threatened to cause a civil uprising among the Italian guys who walked by in packs. Becky loved the attention. She's come a long way from the shy crypto nerd she was just 3.5 years ago. Her bright and sunny personality remained the same, and her almost unearthly intelligence was the same as always. But like the fine wine we enjoyed, my wife achieved an exquisite balance of complexity, power, and elegance from a legendary vintage. She knew how to enjoy life. She continued to give me playful glances as she slowly spread and then crossed her legs again, knowing what this does to the male population. Old Becky would be embarrassed. The new one considered it a kind of sport. She read my expression and said, "Do not look at me so. You've changed just as much as I have." I laughed out loud. Of course she's right. People may say that money can't buy happiness. This may or may not be true, but money certainly makes time flow pleasantly and calmly. I said based on facts. Well, the woman you have become is much less conflicted than version 1.0. Do not get me wrong. She could rock my world, but Becky, version 2.0. This is a completely different experience. She laughed sultrily and knowingly and said, I stopped fighting it. I love being a woman, with all the advantages it gives me. The other one was just a stupid girl. She lacked the worldly experience to understand and appreciate the power that a woman has. For us, it was part of the new normal. I imagine others have had similar experiences. You close the door to one room and move into another, and when you do this, it seems as if the previous room never existed. It was the same with us. There was betrayal and tragedy in the abandoned room. But this happened to 2 other people in completely different lives. We have completely changed. We have a different, much more luxurious reality. Then my wife's mood turned serious. She said with a hint of nervousness in her voice, I'm afraid this is the last glass of wine I'll drink in the near future. I hope you don't mind, I said. Why should I object? You can drink whatever you want. But personally, I prefer wine. She said, continuing to speak carefully, it could affect you too. Now I was puzzled and said, how can your choice of drinks affect my life? She said, what if I say that I have to stop drinking because I'm pregnant? It took a second. I admit I'm dumb. Then it dawned on me, and the roller coaster soared to new, completely unimaginable heights. It's one thing to share your life with the woman you love. It's quite another to raise children with her. Becky looked at me with barely suppressed glee. I stood up, grabbed her from the seat, and hugged her, speaking with such genuine feeling that I seemed to have never experienced. I love you. And in the fullness of time, another door opened in my life. But that was in a different place. And that's another story. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.